David Cameron said, if you elect me, I will create a cancer drugs fund.
That's brilliant.
Yes and no. While the English patients had every cancer medicine they wanted, people in Wales had none of the new cancer medicines that were coming through. How you determine who's got 6 months to live is an interesting question. But actually, are those the people who are least well served by our healthcare system? The problem is you only get to be the bad guy. No one's ever going to do a study with that drug again. So does it matter? Yeah, it does. It does matter. Potential drugs that we give to patients in clinical trials never actually make it through. Politics that brings people together, for me, works better than that which divides.
Because I would assume if it's going to save someone's life, the NHS would pay for it, right?
Depends how much it costs to save that person's life.
Welcome to the Visionary Podcast, where we discuss science, medicine, physical health, and mental well-being. Dr. David Montgomery. We've had all sorts of guests here in the studio. We had longevity experts, dermatologists, GPs, all sorts, and people usually understood what they did. When people ask you, what do you actually do? How would you respond?
Great question. I'm a pharmaceutical physician, and what that means is I work for a pharmaceutical company, a drug company. And I think the purpose of drug companies is to develop medicines, and then people often forget the next bit, actually make them available to patients. So I work in a function called medical affairs, and my role really is to take medicines that have been developed by my company and take them through the commercialization process, so make them available to patients. That involves ensuring that the NHS is willing to pay for them. It involves working with the healthcare system to ensure that people are able to prescribe them, that we're able to the manufacturing process, all these other elements of it that sit between making a medicine and a patient at home taking a medicine for the disease.
Yeah, that's a very beautifully humane way to simplify a very complex role. You've had a remarkable journey from starting as a surgeon to now leading innovation in pharmaceutical medicine. You've worked in the NHS, Pharma, charities, policy making. Is there a thread that ties all these sectors together for you?
There are a number of threads for me. So, and I think I probably am quite unusual. I wouldn't say I'm unique, but I'm probably unusual. So one thing that's really tied my career together has been oncology. So everything I've ever done has been related to cancer. And actually, even more serendipitously, mostly breast cancer. So right the way through my career, there has been breast cancer as a fairly common theme. My wife, incidentally, is a consultant breast surgeon as well. So we have a sort of family interest in breast cancer. So every role I've done really has had that element of it. But actually, one of the things I think people forget is that life sciences is an ecosystem where we've got pharmaceutical companies, we've got charities, we've got politicians sitting in Westminster making laws, we've got companies developing drugs, we've got companies developing apps and diagnostics, we've got people making x-ray machines. And none of these organizations do this in isolation. Ultimately, we're all doing something that contributes to improving the healthcare of patients, and in lots of these commercial entities, improving the financial situation of the country.
I shared with you over the phone that I have a friend whose job is to decide whether a medication should be bought by the NHS and eventually to be delivered to patients or not. She sits on a panel with a number of people, which is never helpful, to decide whether it's worth it to buy this medication or not. It's not the argument whether the medication works or not, because this is for granted. Yeah, it should have great potential, but is it worth it? Is it good value to buy this very expensive drug to benefit tiny number of people? Now, it seems that there is an inherent tension between the NHS trying to be efficient and pharma companies trying to make money. Is real partnership here doable?
Let me step back a little bit, because it probably is worth just clarifying for your audience. What you've said is correct. there are a number of hurdles that we need to get through. So, and I think within the industry, we often think about proving that a medicine works for a condition. So what we typically do with clinical trials, if you get invited to be part of a clinical trial, we collect evidence to show how well a medicine works in any given disease area. And then there is a very rigorous regulatory process where, and in the UK, we have one body which does that called the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, and they make a very strong determination of the clinical effectiveness, the safety and effectiveness of a medicine. But of course, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story then is, does the NHS want to pay for this drug? Is it sufficiently beneficial at the price that
sufficiently beneficial?
Yeah, is it making enough of a difference relative to what it's going to cost? Okay. Because the healthcare system has a fixed budget and it has to buy things, and it can't buy everything. And so if you're a senior leader in the healthcare system and you've got a fixed budget, the question is, do you buy that medicine or that surgical device or that extra member of staff? What is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of overall population health? Quite often we get into important questions about our own health and our own diseases, but the reality is we've not got a private insurance system. So in a situation like the NHS, we've really got to make sure that we're using our money to treat the biggest number of patients in the most efficient way possible.
But what is the downside of this? That certain diseases, like new treatments for cancer, for example, or rare diseases, those patients might miss out on new medications. Is this a downside? Is this what we're risking here?
Yeah, potentially. And I think that is one of the great challenges. So I've set the scene a little bit there, but let me go back to answer the question you actually asked, which was, it's expensive developing medicines. Probably $1.5 billion to develop every medicine.
Who pays for this mostly?
Investors and shareholders, typically, okay. And revenue, of course. So money being given by governments to buy those medicines. And there are some inefficiencies in the system. Not all medicines succeed. So most medicines, most potential drugs that we give to patients in clinical trials never actually make it through. They don't work as we think they will, or they have too many side effects. And so
that's an easy argument, really. If they don't work, they don't work.
Sure, but all of these, there are development costs associated. So pharmaceutical companies spend quite a lot of money developing medicines and have to recoup that investment. And I think that's a very live argument just now, as you've probably seen in the press. There's this very live discussion in America. The Americans believe they pay too much for medicines relative to the rest of the world. The pharmaceutical industry, I think, believes that the NHS gets an extremely good deal.
They probably do.
Has been excellent at driving discounts from the pharmaceutical industry, and I think there's a tension there. But again, I talk about this from a system perspective because I think this is really important. Companies employ staff and invest in countries,
and they need to be sustainable.
Right? So it needs to be sustainable, and so I think it is feasible, but I think it's difficult to do it just from the lens of the cost effectiveness analysis. If you think about the committees which are making decisions about whether this individual medicine is good value for money or not, I think governments need to sit back and think, how much do we want to be spending on medicines? How much do we feel that we need to spend in order to attract the investment from the pharmaceutical companies? Because these partnerships are more complex than just a simple transaction, a simple, I'll sell you a medicine, you buy a medicine. We do development, we do clinical trials in the UK, we do all of these other things, and I think we sometimes lose sight of that.
Yeah. So a real partnership is possible when both sides focus on outcomes. Mm-hmm. This is what you're telling me, not just like winning arguments or acquiring territory kind of thing. Well, again, at the risk of sounding unrealistic and naive, we're supposed to be a rich country, right? Why do we need to restore to the logic, or that logic of value argument of cost?
The British government has done a really good job of keeping costs down within the pharmaceutical budgets, within the drug budget. They are very efficient at medicines for a certain period of time, relatively short period of time, have a patent. They're branded medicines, and they typically are more expensive. But eventually that patent protection runs out, and it allows other companies to copy that medicine and introduce cheap versions of the same medicine.
Is that the branded stuff and the generic
generics.
Stuff?
Yeah, those are generics.
Are generic stuff medications usually as effective as a branded?
Absolutely they are. And there is a regulatory process to make sure they are as well. And the government is very good at generic substitution. So at the point of medicines going off patent, the government really does quite quickly and effectively, the NHS.
So the NHS itself is the one commissioning the generic stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, but this means that pharma is losing out
after
all the developments and research.
It means that you get a short period of time at these, we talk about high prices, but you get a short period of time as an innovator to recoup that investment. And if you're a vacuum manufacturer and you patent something, then you own that patent forever, right?
If you have a new drug or innovation that you put the development and research into it, you're not going to have patent on it forever.
That's right. So that's not the truth. That's exactly so. So in lots of industries, you get to keep your intellectual property forever, right?
Yes.
Whereas in the pharmaceutical industry, that's not true.
Oh, okay.
Government's been very good at keeping costs down through taxation system, through NICE, do a very good job of negotiating cost as well, negotiating price as well.
Hi, I'm Hala, your host today. If you're enjoying what you see, please hit that lovely subscribe button. It will mean a lot to us. Or maybe a small podcast now, but with your support, we can build this channel together, one step at a time. Thank you so much for being part of it.
How is that done usually? How can we make medicines and new treatments affordable for the NHS? Is it a matter of negotiations with pharmaceutical companies? Is there more nuance to this?
So the government in the UK has, I think, 3 really key mechanisms for keeping prices down within medicines. And some of those are more controversial than others. The NHS is very, very good at substituting branded medicines for generic medicines and often cheaper medicines at the end of life cycle. At the beginning of the life cycle, the healthcare system in the UK, there's an organisation called NICE in England, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which assesses every medicine for cost effectiveness. So it looks at the benefits that the medicine brings and it looks at the cost of the medicine. And I'm not going to get into great technical details about how it does that, but there's a consistent way that it does that. And they make a decision about how much they were willing to pay for the benefits of that medicine. And they can do that consistently across all drugs. The industry NICE was introduced in 1999 and had a threshold that they were willing to pay a certain amount of money for a certain amount of benefit.
No matter what the illness or the condition.
No matter what the illness or the condition, exactly. They've got a consistent way of measuring benefit that is consistent across all illnesses. The threshold that NICE is willing to pay hasn't changed since 1999. And industry...
Not with even inflation?
Not with inflation. Nope, it's exactly the same price. So industry does have an issue with that. In therapy areas where there's been constant evolution, constant innovation, then there has been inflation as a consequence of, each medicine that's a little bit better than the next means we're not exactly comparing it to 1999 prices. But areas where there's been much less innovation, if you've got very cheap medicines because nothing's happened and they've all gone off patent, and then you try and bring some real innovation in, it's very difficult to show cost effectiveness against a very cheap medicine. And then the third thing the government has is a tax system clawback. So at a system level within the healthcare industry and government negotiate every 5 years a settlement, an agreement on how much the industry, how much the government is willing to spend on medicines, essentially. I'm simplifying it quite significantly. But the total medicines bill is therefore capped. And if it goes above a certain spend, then government gets a clawback. And at the moment, the clawback is very high.
Clawback.
Into the 20%. Yeah. So industry has to pay money back from its profits to the government.
The pharmaceutical companies pay back
into government.
And this is an agreement that the NHS has with all pharmaceutical
companies. Government has with the pharmaceutical industry, yes.
And this is a requirement.
Negotiated through the trade body. Everyone signs up to it. And it covers all branded medicines and unbranded medicines are different deals. And so the healthcare system has lots of levers for keeping medicine prices down. And this is a really live debate at the moment. Industry is very much of the view that the thresholds for cost effectiveness are too low, that the amount of money that we pay back from profits, i.e. the amount of tax that companies are paying is too high. And government doesn't think that.
Oh, of course not.
Because we have a challenging economic situation in the UK. You know, we've slightly run out of money. We're about to have a budget, and Rachel Reeves is trying to work out which taxes she puts up because we've got a challenging financial situation. And so that's a very interesting discussion because, of course, in recent weeks and months, companies have been concerned about how much investment they're willing to make into the UK in the face of government unwillingness to pay for medicines.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting, a very complicated situation. I'm not bothered about how much, as me, Hala, just a patient, I'm not bothered about how much pharmaceutical companies make as profit. I'm definitely bothered about the research and development of new products, of whatever enhancing the medications already on the market, and who does that? Pharmaceutical companies. So they obviously need the money to channel funds into new treatments. That's what I'm thinking. If we take money from their profit, is this false economy to paying so cheaply? I mean, yeah, well, we need affordable drugs, but is it false economy, do you think, that we negotiate the best deal over the expense of product development down the line in the future?
I think it's a really good question. I think industry would argue that it is, and I think it's expensive, long, time-consuming, difficult to make medicines. And I think companies pharmaceutical companies will give money back to investors, of course. But of course, who are investors? Investors are often you and I with our pensions. So this isn't nameless, faceless corporate entities. If everyone benefits, if the companies in our stock exchanges do well, everyone benefits as a consequence of that, because we all have pensions, we all have investments, we all have all these other things. So yeah, I think there's a real tension there. I mean, I'm now not in the pharmaceutical. I no longer work for a drug company. I'm an independent pharmaceutical physician, so I can step away from the argument a little bit and have my own views and opinions on it. But I think at the moment the balance feels to me wrong. It feels like the healthcare system, the government, and the pharmaceutical industry are more further apart than they have been for a long time in terms of seeing the value of medicines. I think that's certainly what the industry bodies would say. And in my career, I've sat on many of these committees as well. I've sat on the Scottish Medicines Consortium, which is the body in Scotland that makes cost effectiveness decisions, and I've been part of that thinking. I was a panelist on the Cancer Drugs Fund from 2012 to 2015, and that was the body who made decisions about whether we funded cancer medicines. So I've been involved in these discussions at a very high level for a long time, and it just feels just now the most negative it's been for a long time. It's always been a challenge, there's always been a tension, but just now it just feels the most negative it's been.
You've also spoken about the hurdles a new drug faces before it's approved by the NHS. Mm-hmm. What's fair and what's frustrating about this process when a new drug is introduced to the market? It is a long process, isn't it?
This is one area which I think Britain has been getting really good at. So yes, it is a long process. Pharmaceutical innovation, healthcare innovation, it's really important to get it right. And we've seen historically situations where we haven't got it right. The most famous one would be Thalidomide, for example, where a medicine was introduced to counter morning sickness, probably didn't have sufficient evidence base for use in pregnant women, and caused birth defects in lots and lots of children. So lots of children were born with arm and particularly upper limb abnormalities.
When was that?
Oh goodness, you've asked me an interesting question. In the late 50s, early 60s, I think. I can't remember exactly when thalidomide was.
Do we have data on what exactly happened? Was it short clinical trials or something?
We do know what happened. It's very complicated, but the drug had an effect on how blood vessels developed, and as a consequence, it had an effect on how limbs developed, how arms and legs developed. So there are examples in the far history of having insufficient evidence, and I think regulators have gotten very good at getting that balance right. Regulators and drug companies have worked together very closely. I think we have a risk proportionate approach to regulation. So if you're going to produce a medicine that treats headache in pregnant women, headache, not a dreadfully serious disease, it won't kill you,
thinking, yeah.
and you're pregnant with a child, so the risks of harm are much higher. So the evidence you would need for that medicine and that indication, we think about it slightly differently than we think about it in end-of-life cancer. So if someone's dying of cancer and a medicine shows a potentially strong effect on reducing the risk of dying, then clearly we will find ways of getting that to patients in a safe and controlled way more quickly.
It's a calculated risk, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think governments, I think regulators have been brilliant at that. We are starting to see the medicines regulator in the UK since Brexit become very innovative. I think they're doing some really clever things. There's a new chief executive, Lawrence Talon, who I think has got incredible energy and is doing some really brilliant stuff. One of the really exciting things that they're doing is they're now partnering with NICE. And it's an early stage in the process, but they are very much looking to create a process where you can go through both the regulatory steps and the market access, the reimbursement, the cost effectiveness steps in parallel. And what is really frustrating in the UK is that a drug gets a marketing authorization, the regulator says it's safe to use, and you then have a 6-month or 9-month delay before the NHS is willing to pay for it. And that's very frustrating for patients.
And is it NICE who decides this?
Yeah, NICE in England and Wales and the SMC in Scotland. NICE and the regulator are now working much more closely together to make those decisions on the same day. That's the target. They're really pushing.
On the same day might be a little push.
With coordination, they can do it. That's certainly the ambition, and I think that's really exciting. I think that would really improve how quickly we get these innovations through. The frustration for me, you asked about what's going well. I think what's going well is the regulators and others are really looking to speed this up as quickly as we can. I think we're doing amazing work there. The frustration is that once it's reimbursed, we still don't see medicines being rolled out in the healthcare system as quickly, universally as quickly as they could. So some doctors, some hospitals, some institutions start prescribing immediately. Others continue to use existing medicines for quite a long time. And so the uptake curve is quite slow. I think we need to get better at saying, right, this medicine's been shown to be effective. We've negotiated a price that we consider to be cost effective. Let's start using it.
What happens in the middle? Is it bureaucracy?
I think it's more of a clinical decision making. I think it's keeping up with innovation. I don't batter the healthcare system because it's full of extraordinarily busy people with extraordinarily difficult jobs, and keeping up with every innovation and knowing what's going on all the time. If you're a general practitioner, how on earth do you keep up with every new medicine and the evidence base for it? I think that's very, very challenging. And so the question for me is, how do we help and support the uptake of innovation, knowing that the healthcare system is incredibly busy, it's stretched, it's difficult. People want to do the best for the patients. That is, in all the roles I've ever done, you asked me about my sort of driving motivation. The one thing I see throughout the healthcare system is professionals who want to do the best for their patients. That's really consistent for me, wherever I see it. But it's tricky keeping up to date sometimes.
Yeah, but is there a space in which we could maybe modernize how the NHS decides which medication is worth it? There is a space of improvement.
Yeah, we do that to an extent. I think again, we're beginning to think about that more carefully. Some therapeutic areas, some disease areas do it better than others.
Give us examples, please. Examples. Like I'm thinking in terms of new treatments, new medications, I'm always thinking of rare diseases, cancer. By default, if it's new, there is a certain degree of innovation and investment behind it. So it's never an easy decision to replace old medications in the first place.
I think that's right. So I think, and it's complicated by the fact that clinical trials are done one drug against another. So you know your medicine is better than the drug you tried it against, but there may be other options, there may be other treatments, there may be different lines of treatment. Certainly in cancer, we don't typically give someone one drug. We give them a drug until it stops working, and then we give them another medicine until it stops working, and then we give them another medicine until it stops working. And how you sequence those is often becomes, as you develop more and more evidence, it becomes more and more challenging to work out the best sequence for giving medicines in which drugs you should give sooner in the journey versus later.
When you say stops working, what does that mean, please?
So if someone's got a cancer and it's not curable, it's not been removed by surgery, we give medicines to shrink it or stop it growing, but eventually those medicines stop and the cancer starts to grow again, and we'll swap the medicine in. In cancer, we've been very good at that. There are lots of organisations which look at all of the evidence and try and provide guidance to doctors about how to use the different treatments and which order to use them in. I think we've been very good at that in some areas. I think in other areas, it's been less good. Again, typically in primary care, in general practice, it's sometimes harder for doctors to get that evidence base and to understand which medicines they should be using when.
I read somewhere that sometimes a new treatment is allowed for a limited amount of time while doctors collect results from patients. Are we using this option enough?
I think there are lots of things we could do about clinical uncertainty. So we are exploring approaches. So typically you do clinical trials until you know a medicine is likely to be safe and effective, and then you roll it out to the whole population. That is what you typically do.
When researchers or scientists decide this medicine is potentially effective, what is the percentage here? Is this a safe, they're like potentially effective or beneficial with minimum side effects? Are we thinking from 70% to 80% effective? Because at that point, there were some clinical trials, but it wasn't ruled yet to be used over the whole population. What is the percentage?
It really depends. It really depends. So if you've got, and this is causing some controversy within the Alzheimer's space at the moment, because we've got medicines that have shown that they slow progression of Alzheimer's down a relatively small amount. And there's a real discussion about whether it's enough to use the medicines at the moment. NICE says it isn't relative to how much they cost. And so it depends. It depends on how serious the disease is. It depends on how expensive the medicine is. It depends on a whole bunch of things. And that's why the regulators and NICE use the wisdom and judgment they do to be able to create frameworks, to be able to create processes that allow us to make those decisions from different medicines and different classes, where the effects will be bigger or smaller, where the risk of the disease will be greater or less. So yeah, the system I think does a very good job of that uncertainty. Where I think we could get much better, I believe, if I was in NICE or the regulator just now, one of the things I think we're much less good at is cost effectiveness. So quite often the regulators will provide a medicine a marketing authorization because it looks really effective in cancer, but it's had relatively few studies. Perhaps we've not got a trial which compared the new medicine to an old medicine. We've given the medicine to a group of people. It seems to work really, really well at shrinking their tumours. We know all the other treatments that we've got don't work at all well. And so the regulator says, right, in this instance, that's enough evidence for us to allow this to be sold to patients. They will insist on doing another trial to make sure that we've got data that compares it to another drug. And we'll do that in parallel. So they give a conditional marketing authorization so we can sell it, but at the same time, we've also got to do other trials to just make sure but the disease is so life-threatening that we want to get it out there as quickly as we can. The regulators are very good at that. The payer bodies are so nice, the people who are funding the medicines, we've been less good at that. We now use the Cancer Drugs Fund for that purpose. So if a medicine looks very effective, but it's tricky to work out exactly how cost effective it is because we've got a relatively small evidence base. The NHS, the healthcare system, will put it onto the Cancer Drugs Fund and will fund that medicine while the company completes more studies or collects more evidence in the real world setting. And so that's been really, really helpful. It's only in cancer. We set up an innovative medicines fund for non-cancer medicines 2 or 3 years ago, but very, very few medicines have gone through that. The last time I checked, none have. I think some might now. But we don't use, I don't think, brilliantly collaborate with companies to say, right, okay, this looks really promising. I'm not quite sure how cost effective it is. Let's have an agreement where we really assess that within our healthcare system. I think there's much more we could do.
Yeah, the Cancer Fund, where does this money come from?
Cancer Drugs Fund is a very interesting example of policy.
Good policy?
Good policy, bad policy, all sorts of things. If you've got time, it might be interesting for me to give you a little bit of history on the Cancer Drugs Fund.
A snapshot would be lovely, thank you.
Because it's a really interesting example, I think, of some of the challenges. So the Cancer Drugs Fund was a bit of a reaction to a political challenge. So ahead of the 2010 general election, cancer drugs, people were really worried about them. NICE was saying no. The companies were saying, we can't afford to give you these medicines at such low prices. NICE was saying the prices are too high. Lots of medicines weren't getting through. Patients weren't getting access. So David Cameron said, if you elect me, I will create a cancer drugs fund. I will put £350 million aside and I'll use it to pay for cancer medicines. And he won the 2010 general election in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and he implemented a cancer drugs fund.
That's brilliant.
Well, yes and no. So this is one of these areas which I think is really interesting from a policy perspective. So there was no mechanism for how you would assess whether these medicines, now they'd had a license, so they were clinically effective, but the companies could charge whatever they wanted because they weren't going to be put through an assessment of their cost effectiveness. Oh. So the companies released these medicines onto the Cancer Drugs Fund, usually at a list price with no discount. And
surely there should someone be at the fund assessing this, right?
Well, yeah. So there was a new pot of money, but there was no process put in place for that.
It's just extreme. There is NICE looking at pennies.
So yeah, okay. So very, very interesting. So and not only that, each region was given a pot of money. So there were 10 regions, and so there was no consistency region by region to what was being spent. Because the money was being ring-fenced there, companies weren't getting NICE approval any longer, because they were just going straight onto the Cancer Drugs Fund.
Okay.
Now, NICE makes decisions that cover England and Wales. The Cancer Drugs Fund covered England. So for this period of time, no new cancer medicines were ever made available in Wales because NICE wasn't saying yes to anything. So all the Welsh patients, while the English patients had every cancer medicine they wanted, people in Wales had none of the new cancer medicines that were coming through. So
we solved the problem by creating other problems.
So it was very interesting. We had a policy which seemed amazing. Let's pay for all cancer medicines, but had significant unintended consequences. And the Cancer Drugs Fund, I then was asked, a very smart guy called Peter Clark at NHS England was asked to centralise it and build a process for the Cancer Drugs Fund. And he did that. I was part of the committee which helped do that. So by 2015, I think we had quite a well-functioning Cancer Drugs Fund. And subsequent to that, because, again, it was spending money and it was slightly out of the NICE process, again, government was persuaded to tweak it again and bring Cancer Drugs Fund into NICE. So it became a pot of money available only for medicines that had gone through the NICE process and might be cost-effective, and more data were needed to be captured.
So do you think there is more balance now?
So it's brilliant now. It's brilliant. I mean, it's a really great example, I think, of a terrible policy which had just not been thought through, which caused quite significant untold consequences initially, but where really smart people in our healthcare system and in our industry and lots of others and in government, as they realised there were challenges, to be fair, over a period of time, we didn't just abandon it. We said, right, okay,
Let's fix it.
what's great about this?
Yeah.
What could it be? And over a period of time, it became what it is today, which is a fund for managing uncertainty and a way of accessing medicines earlier when the data might otherwise mean the company wouldn't accept the price. And I think that's really clever. I think it's a lovely bit of policy making, but also policy adjusting as you go, which I think is a really good example of innovation in the UK.
The MHRA, who are those people? What do they do? Are they enabling innovation in medicine or slowing innovation down?
The MHRA are our sovereign regulator, and I have no doubt, no hesitation in saying that the MHRA are really trying very hard. So they're a government body. They're civil servants, and they have been tasked by government with ensuring that medicines and other healthcare products that are released into the UK are safe and effective for human use. And so there's a balance. There's always a balance to be struck. But I think you now hear senior leaders at MHRA talking about risk proportionate regulation.
What does that mean, please?
That's where you may think very differently about the evidence you need for a medicine where someone's got a very serious end of life terminal disease versus something that's more for treating side effects of a more mild condition. The MHRA is really thinking just now about technology. We're starting to see incredible innovation coming through. So artificial intelligence being used to help guide treatment decisions, to help create medicines more effectively, to help build a better understanding of how a medicine's likely to behave in a patient. There's huge amounts of innovation happening. Quantum computing is going to really fundamentally shift the way we can think about how medicines interact with the healthcare system. It's going to really just speed up how quickly we can calculate. I'm not an expert on quantum computing, but it's really going to fundamentally shift how quickly we can calculate things and model things. So, and I think that's going to lead to faster, more efficient, cleverer drug discovery, but it will involve very different processes than we did in the past. So in the past, we gave medicines to animals to see what happened before we would give them to humans. We're trying to move away from giving medicines to animals because actually...
How are we going to test?
So I think we will build very complex system in using cells but also using computer models. And the regulator, the MHRA, is one of the regulators in the world which is right at the vanguard of how we think about regulating these new technologies. So no, I've been incredibly impressed by the MHRA. I think we're very, very lucky to have them. I think they keep our population safe, and I think they do a really brilliant job of pushing forward our medicines regulation, the way we think about innovating in the UK. I think we're very lucky to have them.
Okay, that's brilliant. But when we talk about new technology now, is the NHS ready to adopt these new technologies? We have AI, we have gene therapy, precision medicine. Are we ready with our very complicated or sophisticated, let's say, processes, or bureaucracy?
Adopting really complex new technology at scale, I worry that population-wide, I worry that we're not. I think, and it's very interesting because we're now seeing a huge change in how the NHS is structured. So Labour have come into power. Wes Streeting, as the Health Secretary, has recognised there are some challenges within our health system. He's published a number of very important plans. So the 10-year plan for the NHS was published during the summer, and also the life sciences sector plan was written, which is what Labour are going to do to try and encourage the life sciences to invest and help us grow innovative companies within the UK. Those documents were written together by people who spoke to each other very regularly, so they are utterly consistent with one another. Are they ambitious enough? Are they driven enough? Is there enough detail? These are all things we can argue about, but there's a lot of work going on to think about the future of the healthcare system. But it's still, I think, largely focused on the big ticket items. So the three real strands are treatment to prevention. So we're moving towards preventing disease more than waiting till people have got disease and treat it. So that's a public health intervention. Hospital to local, or hospital to neighbourhood. I can't remember the exact expression, but
And they are concerned about prevention mainly.
well, I think it's one of the big strands. I mean, clearly we need to treat people with disease, but ideally in the healthcare system, you spend less money if you can stop people getting disease in the first place. So that's really important. And then analog to digital. But I think that final element and the question of adoption of really complex technology is going to be the thing that's going to be most difficult for the NHS. The NHS has a long track record of not being great at digital innovation. We think of it as one system, but of course it's not one system. It's lots of general practices and lots of hospitals and lots of integrated care boards, and they're all doing somewhat different things.
I've noticed.
So it's not like if you work for Pfizer and you decide you want to have a new email system, you just introduce a new email system.
Yeah, it's not as simple as
100,000
NHS.
people are forced to use it, right? That is that is how it works in a big corporate structure. The healthcare system doesn't work like that. It's not structured like that. We think of the NHS as a single thing, but it's not. It's lots and lots of different things.
Yes, when I first moved into this country 16 years ago, coming from Egypt, I assumed that this country is super, super high tech. And I was registered with my local surgery and everything. But there was a point, maybe 2 years later, when I had to go to the hospital for another check or procedure. And I immediately assumed that the hospital has all my medical record, my medications, my history, it's in the same city. But that wasn't true. I was asked what kind of health conditions, and I have a long list of that. And I had to, in a way, fill in the gaps, me as a patient with my failing memory about medications and about conditions. And the lovely nurse was jotting down quickly. I was like, how primitive is that? And I was like, maybe the system could use a centralized data platform or something, so nothing would go wrong. I'm not trying to be critical, but so everything is clear and physicians are enlightened, and the time invested into collecting data again from patients, it's already there.
I agree completely. I mean, I think, and I think government understands this too. Making it happen is challenging. People worry about their data being discovered by other people, but there is a real push to really optimize what the NHS app is. So the NHS app really came into its own during COVID because everyone had to have it to show they had a COVID vaccine, or you couldn't travel anywhere. So people used it, and it became sort of part of the system. But I mean, that's the holy grail. The holy grail is that you have an NHS app on your phone. It has your clinical records in it so that you've got access to them. They're your records ultimately. And we've got, genetic data on there, and we've got all sorts of other data that people need. And then you've got a real opportunity, I think. So getting people involved in clinical trials is quite hard. Getting representative samples of patients into clinical trials is quite hard in the UK. I mean, we still are disproportionately white clinical trial participants. It's difficult to get participants.
Would that make a difference? I was reading about diversity, and of course I'm all about diversity, but it's the same. Oh no, not necessarily different genetics, right?
Yeah, you can see different types of populations having very different ways in which they process or handle different medicines. You definitely see that, and so I think it is really important that we understand how medicines work across a whole patient population. That doesn't mean they necessarily have to put patients into clinical trials. That is what people think about. We should have a representative sample of our communities in clinical trials. I'm actually more interested in just making sure that we've got ways of collecting the data afterwards. Real world evidence is really, really important. How do we ensure within our healthcare system that when we give someone a medicine, we've got a really good understanding of the effect it has in the real world. And then we can be sure, it becomes easier for us to be sure that there aren't unusual effects in subpopulations that we didn't see in the clinical trials because we didn't have enough of a sample. So that's really, really important, I think, as well. But the NHS app could be amazing because you could use it to find the right people for your clinical trials. You can use it to approach people directly and say, we're doing this study, we're looking for people exactly like you, with your history, with your genetics, with your disease, and you can find them, and people become, it's very clear that people who are involved in clinical trials do better. People who go to hospitals which are active in clinical trials, even if they don't go into a trial themselves, do better than people who don't. And so
that's a brilliant solution, actually, because I was thinking, what are the logistics behind the clinical trials? How do we find patients or regular people who are willing to come or drive for a certain...
It's very, very hit and miss at the moment.
Yes.
At the moment, a company will say, right, I'm going to open this clinical trial in 10 hospitals, and the doctors in that hospital say, right, this trial is for these kind of patients. And they don't phone anyone up. They just wait for those kind of patients to come through the door. And if they do, great. And if they don't recruit anyone. And we have this huge problem with clinical trials that we spend a lot of money setting them up. And lots of the hospitals, lots of the trials don't recruit the right number of patients, don't recruit any patients sometimes.
Yeah, I've recently took part in some survey blood. They only needed a blood test for me with a voucher in exchange about it. Okay, but the nice thing is they were at booths. So all I had to do when I was there doing whatever to give blood, and it was super, super convenient for me.
Yeah.
And I got the voucher,
Yeah.
and they had their data.
And we're doing quite a lot of that with sort of population. There's a project called My Future Health that Sir John Bell is running. And
I think that was it.
And was that your and that's a lovely project. It's a really clever project. He's trying to collect information on a large number of people, and we will use that information for preventing disease, for working out how to better treat disease, for understanding population health. And the UK is uniquely placed to do this with a single. The NHS gives us a real advantage. Most other countries can't do this kind of thing. We've been talking about it for a long time. We've never really been able to take advantage. And I think that's what I really hope happens over the rest of this period of government. I hope we really embrace those new technologies, because at the moment, as the question you asked, are we ready to innovate in certain hospitals? I think we're very, very good in some hospitals, in some areas, of introducing new treatments, and even complicated new treatments, difficult new treatments.
What kind of areas? Privileged areas?
Not necessarily. So they tend to be large academic teaching hospitals. So Imperial, UCL, the Royal Marsden for cancer, the Christie Hospital in Manchester for cancer. These
where there are big universities.
Big universities, yeah, exactly. So, and those serve quite diverse patient populations. But if you live in the Lake District, then you don't necessarily have access to those big specialist hospitals, and you're more likely to get more of your treatment in the community or in your local hospital. And I think some of the new treatments, some of the really complicated, particularly for rare diseases. Rare disease tends to be treated quite centrally. If you've got very rare diseases, you typically see a small number of really specialist centres.
Yeah.
So people with rare diseases often have to travel quite far for their hospital care.
Is there a chance that there could be a certain kind of cooperation or partnership between specialised hospitals and local surgeries?
Wherever possible, I think we try and do that, but there are certain things that are more difficult to, if you've not got an expert, particularly if you give a treatment and there are side effects from it. Often you need to be near a specialist centre for that kind of management. So we do try and do that. But no, I think innovation in the NHS, I think it will always continue to be rolled out first in the major institutions, and then take a longer period of time to reach everyone. That's what I'd like to see become, and we'd see it even with not complicated. I think we talked earlier about medicines. Uptake of medicines is often very good in specialist centres and often much slower actually in other areas. Surgical techniques, even really complicated surgery, we roll it out very quickly in teaching hospitals, large teaching hospitals, big academic units. Very often the kind of surgery you get in smaller units may not have the same scope, the same opportunities, the same potential.
Circling back to introducing new drugs to patients, I read somewhere that Germany gives patients access to new drugs and treatments almost immediately after authorization. Why can't we do the same?
Yeah, it does. The German system's interesting. So it introduces at full price, and then they have payer negotiations and eventually settle on final price. I think the challenge with that, so I shouldn't say things that the industry is going to hate. I would rather do things sustainably. So the potential disadvantage, the thing that you would need to watch out for in that sort of arrangement, is that you reach a conclusion after a period of time that the drug isn't cost effective, or the company isn't willing to bring the price to the level you want it to be. You fail to reach an agreement and you withdraw the drug from the market. That is a really challenging situation, because then you get patients who have access for a while, maybe stop having access after a period of time. So I think whatever you do, my preference is that you do it in a sustainable way. You do it in a way that, you know, once you've got a medicine onto the market, assuming that you don't get a safety signal or something else comes up where you have to withdraw because it doesn't turn out to be a safety, you thought it was. But assuming all else being equal, once you've released a medicine onto the market and people have access to it, they should have it forever. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
and so that's one of the sort of disadvantages. I do think we're moving really interesting direction now. I mean, I would really encourage. We've got this brilliant opportunity. The MHRA, the regulator, and NICE, the payer, are working more closely together than they ever have before. They're very committed to joint scientific advice, where you sit, when very early on in your development program, you can sit with the regulator, NICE, and NHS England and show them your data, tell them what you're doing, ask for their feedback. You can iron out problems with your study design, with your evidence package at that stage. So I think engaging very early on in your development program so that you know you're collecting the right data, and then having the MHRA and NICE do a joint assessment or a parallel assessment so that they agree together that it's clinically effective and cost effective, and you get a decision at the end of which you can roll the medicine out there and then. I think for me, that would be my great preference. And then probably more flexibility with outcomes. So in situations where there are unanswered questions, we have a process where you can consistently have access at a price. And once you've answered those questions, once you've got a better understanding of the data, that price can change. It can go up if it turns out it's more cost effective. In a wonderful world, that would be backdated. So not only if your medicine is more cost effective than you thought and you could have charged a higher price, could they pay that back to the point of launch? I mean, I think there are things that we could do to make the system much more innovative, much more willing to reward innovation.
Yeah, but we're not necessarily being risk averse. We rather seek a sustainable approach or solutions.
Well, that's my take on it. I mean, the German system, German prices tend to be higher, I think, than the UK. It's often difficult to know because the UK has what we call confidential discounts. So NICE agrees a confidential discount with the company. So you're never really sure about how big a discount it is. So we don't really know.
Do we care to know as patients? Do we need to know this?
I don't
Maybe
think
it's
you
an
do.
industry
I think you
thing.
need to trust that your medicine works and it's going to be effective and it's going to do
That's
what
all
it
I care about,
says.
really. Yes.
I think as a government, as a healthcare system, we need to be more transparent about why we say no to medicines if we do end up with a disagreement. Because, I mean, I think quite honestly, the NICE process, the way we assess medicines, it's consistent. It does work for most medicines, but there are quirks in the system where sometimes it doesn't work and doesn't reward innovation as well as it could. We have a measure called the QALY. We're willing to pay a certain amount of money per quality adjusted life year. So a medicine that improves the quality of life or improves the duration of life, so saves lives or improves quality of life, will give you a certain number of QALYs, and the healthcare system is willing to pay a certain amount for each of those. So if you introduce a new medicine, if the existing medicine cost £20,000 in total for a year's treatment, and your additional QALY gain meant you could have 25,000, you get that extra cost. Your entire reimbursement can be what the old medicine cost plus your extra money that you get for being more effective, your QALY gain. So there are a couple of quirks in the system. The first of those is if you don't replace something. So if you're a new medicine and it's innovative and you replace a very expensive drug, then you get all of that cost. If you've a new medicine that's very innovative and there's never been a medicine to treat that area, there's no costs to replace. And so that's really problematic. So therapy areas where there were lots of treatment before NICE came into existence, the very first NICE assessment, if you were being assessed against a more high-cost medicine, then your very first NICE assessment back in 1999, that first medicine would have been more expensive than in a therapy area where there was nothing, placebo, free, whatever, because you don't get the offset cost.
Yeah,
So
but
that's
the
challenging.
way I understood this is that the new medications or treatments that do not replace others, that's where real innovation is.
It's where the innovation is.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's where the unmet need is. And yet it's where you'll get your least reimbursement. Incremental benefit over something already quite expensive is more rewarding than genuine innovation in an area where there's nothing.
Yeah.
Because of the way the system operates. An incremental innovation, if you introduce a medicine that's marginally better every year for 10 years, eventually the medicine at the end of that will be quite expensive, relatively speaking, because it's been incrementally more expensive than each relatively expensive medicine. If you don't innovate for 15 years, then you might be comparing against the generic medicine.
Yeah.
Interestingly, if you get your NICE assessment the year before something goes off patent versus the year after it goes off patent, you can have quite a big price difference because you're all of a sudden you're going up against a cheaper drug.
Yes.
So there are quirks in the system because of how it works. And then there's also multiple indication pricing. So one of the things that's very controversial in cancer is where you've got a medicine that can be used to treat different diseases. Quite a lot of cancer, having a breast cancer or a lung cancer or a colon cancer isn't really the main issue in terms of deciding how you treat it. Cancer is a genetic disease and it's often driven by changes in the proteins in a cell, caused by mutations, caused by cigarette smoking, for example, causes your DNA, the basic building block of life, to change. You get mutations and that can result in a cancer developing. And a lot of our therapies are used to try and target that change, to switch off the gene, to block the protein or whatever. And you tend to find the same proteins are, because they're responsible for cell growth, they exist in every cell in the body. So very often these medicines that block a certain protein will work in a breast cancer that exhibits that protein or a colon cancer that exhibits that protein. Now, the challenge is, of course, the treatments in those two different cancer types will be different. Existing treatments, the chemotherapy options will be different. Some might be more expensive than the other. The drug might work a little bit better in one cancer type than another. So you could find the same medicine being approved for two totally different cancer types and having a very different cost effectiveness case in each one. And the challenge in the healthcare system at the moment in the UK is that once you've got a price, it doesn't go up for a subsequent more cost effective indication. So you could innovate in a really rare tumour and be much more cost effective in that tumour and therefore command a higher price. The NHS struggles to reward that. You get pegged on one price. So there are lots of sort of quirks within the system that make it difficult to navigate.
Here's a silly question. You talked about the first version of medication, the second version, and supposedly there is an improvement within maybe 10 years or something. Why do pharmaceutical companies keep introducing, if they do, introduce a new version of the medication? I'm thinking, is this to address side effects maybe?
Yeah, it can be. When you put a drug into a person, when you take a medicine, it does things in the body.
Physiological changes,
It does things to the body. It does physiological changes. One of those things is what you want it to do, and lots of other things it does aren't what you want it to do, and it causes side effects as a consequence of that. So often you'll find, and by changing the structure of a medicine slightly, you can dial up certain effects more than others. So you can make it more specific for a certain type of protein, and you can target it more towards a specific type of disease. So therefore making it more effective, potentially less toxic, better side effect profile. So very often you'll find a company has a medicine that works for a number of diseases. Some of those diseases it works really, really well for, some it works less well for, but by showing that it worked in those diseases, and that company or another company can look and say, right, okay, what is it about it that's making it work less well in that indication? Can we make a better drug? And that's one of the challenges. Science it's not a perfect art. It's very interesting. We sometimes make discoveries by mistake, totally by mistake. It can be really fascinating, the serendipity of discovery. And once you've made that serendipitous discovery, very often you can improve on what you've originally done. You can make a better drug.
Yeah.
A little bit like antibiotics. Antibiotics are fascinating. So the story of antibiotics is that Alexander Fleming, who ran a lab in West London, St Mary's, I think it's fair to say wasn't always scrupulously clean in his lab practices, from what I understand is the case. So he went on holiday in September 1928. He went on a holiday, and when he came back, some of the jars of bacteria that he left out a mold had grown on them and the bacteria had been killed. And he purified the mold, discovered penicillin, understood how it was working, made a medicine. But once we'd understood how penicillin killed bacteria, it was the first time we'd been able to kill bacteria. And bacteria, if you think about plague and gangrene and all these, a huge portion of human history has been death at the hand of microorganisms. Once we understood how to deal with that, what we could do to kill bacteria without killing humans, it opened the door to create wonderful advanced antibiotics that were even more effective and even safer to use. And I think that's one of the great sort of bits of innovation that we see.
Mentioning antibiotics, do we have a real issue of abusing antibiotics?
One of the great challenges of our time, possibly not quite now, but certainly soon, one of the great fears is antimicrobial resistance. So bugs that no longer respond to antibiotics. I have a great fear that we get to a stage where bacteria are not treatable. That potentially takes us back to a world where we didn't have didn't have antibiotics, didn't have treatments. People used to die of simple infections all the time in large numbers. And when you use antibiotics, every time you use an antibiotic, bugs don't become resistant. This is one of the interesting things. Bugs don't become resistant. They are resistant to an antibiotic. So what happens is you have an infection in your body, and you'll have a ton of bugs in that infection. Most of them will be sensitive to the antibiotic. Most of them will get killed off by the antibiotic. And you maybe have 1%, 2%, 5% of them which are resistant. But by killing off that big, massive infection, your immune system can then do the rest, and it kills off the small proportion of bugs that are resistant. If you don't take the full course, or if you give antibiotics in a needless situation, you can end up killing, and the various different populations keep each other in check. So if you kill off all the sensitive bacteria that exist within your system, in your body, whatever, the risk is then that what you get is an overgrowth of very resistant bacteria that don't respond to the antibiotics. Yeah. And that's the challenge. That's why you shouldn't use antibiotics if you don't need them. If you've not got a bacterial infection, people get given antibiotics because they've got a virus. It's a terrible thing. And you should, if you're given antibiotics, you should take them as directed. Don't stop after a couple of days because you feel better. We really think this stuff through. So it's a really big problem. Innovation in this space is really difficult because we don't want to use, if we invented a new antibiotic, we wouldn't want to use it unless we absolutely had to.
Why is that?
So you wouldn't, because you don't want, if you invent something new, you don't want the bacteria to see it if another medicine would have worked. So it's not like cancer where you want to give it to everyone as soon as you can. If we invent a new antibiotic, eventually resistant strains of bacteria come along for every antibiotic. So the sooner you use an antibiotic and the more you use an antibiotic, the sooner that will happen. So we want to keep any new antibiotics that we create, anything powerful or improved or different, we want to keep it
For a rainy day.
for people who really, really, really need it. And so you're not going to make a lot of money from introducing a new antibiotic.
No.
Because it's not going to replace, it's not going to be, if you introduce a much better version of a blood pressure tablet, then everyone's going to use that because you're not going to get resistance to it. So you're going to use it. So you're going to replace the whole market. So you're going to get huge reward for your innovation. The normal economics don't work for antibiotics. So companies are a little reluctant to spend huge amounts of money doing research and development in an area where those drugs are going to kind of sit on the shelf and be used for very desperate, very severe cases. So we do need to have a conversation about how we do development, research and development in that space. There's a really wonderful project, Lord Darcy, who did the NHS review for Wes Streeting just after Labour came into power, is setting up a network of antimicrobial research centres, one on every continent, I think. Is a really ambitious project. So people are taking it seriously, but you absolutely don't force your GP to give you antibiotics if you don't need them. Take them the way you're supposed to, and for policymakers, we do need to think about how we innovate in this space and reward that innovation appropriately.
It's striking that usually the blockage or the problem is not science itself, but the process and the economics. Yeah. You also referenced the issue of add-on therapies.
Yeah.
What are these therapies? Why are they not being approved in the UK?
So that's a great. If you Google David Montgomery cancer, you'll find a video I did on this many years ago. So if anyone's really interested in this topic, you can look David Montgomery cancer, and there's a video, 3 or 4 minute video, which gives a really big explanation with diagrams and things. But it comes down to my previous point. When you introduce a new medicine, the money that you get for that medicine is the money that you save the system. So the old medicine costs £20,000. So you're no longer spending that. So you get that, plus the reward for innovation, the QALY gain, the extra money that they're willing to pay for a more effective medicine. And the NHS is willing to pay £30,000 per QALY, £20,000 to £30,000 per QALY. So a QALY would be 1 year lived in perfect life, one quality adjusted life year. If you live a year in perfect health, then that's one extra, then that's one QALY. Cancer, typically you don't live in perfect health, so you might live at 50%, 70% health. So let's say you introduce a new medicine that extends life by a year, but the quality of life is half of a normal person's quality of life, or half of perfect health. So the NHS is willing to pay £20,000 per QALY. So you're giving an extra year at half a QALY. So the NHS would be willing to pay £10,000 for that medicine.
Is that how things are judged?
Yeah. So imagine then that you've got a treatment that costs £20,000 for a year and you give it for 1 year. Imagine now that you introduce a new medicine that you take for 2 years. It gives an extra year of life. So you could take it for 2 years. That medicine is worth the 20,000 of the medicine you replaced, plus the 10,000 of your QALY gain. So you get to charge £30,000 for that 2 years of treatment.
Yeah, I get
so
that.
Already you've got a lower monthly price, but your total reimbursement, your total revenue is better. Now, imagine that your treatment works by being added into the existing treatment. Imagine it helps a certain type of resistance. So you discover that drug A does what it did, but drug A plus B gives you an extra year.
Okay, so there is already a first drug that's being paid for by the NHS.
Instead of replacing that medicine, you're adding another treatment on. You're giving 2 drugs to have the effect. Okay. Now, so they're willing to pay an extra £10,000 for the combination because it gives you an extra an extra year at half a QALY. So they're willing to give you that extra £10,000 because it's been innovative. Drug A costs £20,000 per year. You're now giving it for 2 years instead of 1.
Okay, I'll have to run the calculations.
So the first company is now making £40,000 from that medicine. But it wasn't the NHS wasn't willing to pay £40,000. It was only willing to pay the £30,000, the $20,000 for 1 year, plus the £10,000 QALY gain. So all of a sudden, so you can see the same effect. So you've got one drug where you replace the medicine, so you get that £20,000 and you get your QALY gain, Another where you're adding it in on top. You've doubled the treatment with the originator medicine. So, and by doubling the treatment, it costs twice as much. And it costs, the second year costs twice as much as your extra QALY gain they were willing to offer you. So they're willing to give you 30,000 in total. It's now costing 40,000 in total. So that's an example where no matter what you do with your price of your new medicine, it's already going to be not cost effective because you've spent all this extra money on the original product.
But how detrimental or beneficial would the add-on therapies be?
So it's giving you an extra year of life.
That's not so bad for families.
But it's a cost effectiveness thing because most of your reimbursement, most of the value that you get is what you replace. If you're not replacing anything, and if you're actually doubling the amount of time on the treatment, you find yourself in a situation when you can never be cost effective.
Okay. Are these therapies are they pertinent to chronic diseases or serious diseases like
they
cancer,
can be.
for example?
Much more common in cancer. This is something we see in cancer a lot, where you've got a treatment and it works very well. You've got another treatment and it works very well, but when you give them together, they work better than the sum of their parts. So there's an additive gain, often because you're targeting. So we've seen, for example, a drug which targets genetic mutations, which targets the sort of proteins, the bad proteins that are causing the cancer to grow, and it works very well. But you can also add in an immunotherapy that helps stimulate the body's immune system to kill the cancer as well. And so these are two completely different mechanisms, but they both have an impact on the cancer cells. And together they create a better impact than either of those individual medicines on their own. So yeah, we see particularly in cancer, we see this challenge of add-on therapy quite a lot.
Yeah. But it's not necessarily a therapy or a treatment that would save lives. It's usually extends a year as a few months to someone's life. Because I would assume if it's going to save someone's life, the NHS would pay for it, right?
Depends how much it costs to save that person's life.
Yeah.
And that's the honest way, that's the answer.
Right?
So because the NHS is having to make a decision every day about what it's willing to spend its money on, you could have life-saving treatments that aren't cost effective.
That's so sad, but realistically sad.
That's the truth. I agree. I think that's the vagaries of the system. So how do we overcome that? It is a real challenge. I think healthcare system, NICE does have processes and systems in place, in fairness, for looking at cost effectiveness differently in certain disease areas, particularly ultra rare diseases, orphan conditions. There are processes for trying to deal with the challenge of cost effectiveness, but it is true that some treatments are, by their nature, going to have to be very expensive. They're expensive to manufacture. They're expensive to give gene therapies, cell-based therapies. These are complex, difficult manufacturing processes. The patient populations tend to be small.
Yes.
You're manufacturing for each individual person. So each product, each dose, each drug, each intervention is going to be expensive, or it's not going to make a return on investment. And that's the huge challenge, because ultimately drug discovery and drug development is very high risk. It's a commercial enterprise. I worked at a charity. I spent 18 months at Prostate Cancer UK. And when I arrived at Prostate Cancer UK, we were thinking about what we did with our research and how we had a relatively good budget. We had a nice budget, but it wasn't billions of pounds, right? It was millions of pounds, 8 to 12 million pounds a year. I think we were spending on new research, new projects, and inventing a medicine. Every medicine costs about 1.5 billion to develop. Not because some of that's what it costs, but much of that is about the number of medicines, the number of molecules that you've tried to get through the system and have failed. So you spend quite a lot of money looking at candidate drugs that never go anywhere. And so the first question I asked myself at Prostate Cancer UK was, now, if we got lucky, if we invented a medicine, if we spent £5 or £6 million a year on basic science and drug discovery, and we found a medicine in partnership with an academic organisation, and that made it through to patients and became a medicine, we'd be set for life. As a charity, we've invented a medicine that will bring us revenue for the next 10 years, and it can be millions of pounds. And there are charities which have discovered, been part of the early discovery program for a medicine, and they make a lot of money for a period of time as a consequence of having done that. But they're not. But most charities haven't.
Yes.
And that's the real challenge, because you've got to be able to do this at scale. You've got to be able to do it repeatedly and consistently over a period of time, because you've got to have one success to pay for all the failures.
Yeah.
So if you're spending 4 or 5 million a year on drug discovery and you're never successful over 20 years, you've burned through people will eventually stop giving you money. That's the reality. And so that's the balance. There is a space for academic discovery, and charities are good at funding clever early stage research. And the science, I'm being quite simplistic, because sometimes even if you don't find a medicine, as a charity, you're in a situation where everything that fails tells you something about the disease. So there is a space, I think, for charities. I was a bit more absolute about this when I was younger. There is a space for charities to fund that drug discovery work, even if it doesn't find a medicine, because charities are uniquely able to say, well, we're not for profit. We don't need a return on investment. We just need to be able to say we've done great science and we've moved the field forward. And if as a consequence of that, someone else finds a cure, brilliant. Because as a charity, you're not there to make money or become rich. You're there to fix your disease area. You're there to cure patients. That's your mission in life. So I'm being a bit extreme, but the reality is it's an expensive, difficult, long time consuming process, and companies will do it if they feel there's going to be you've got to go to angel investors, you've got to go to venture capital companies, and you've got to raise money. And these companies want to see return on investment. And so they accept that there's an attrition rate, they accept that there's a failure rate, but they're going to want to see success. And when there is success, if you're a venture capital company and you back 10 biotechs, if one of them is successful, you want that success to pay for all the other 9 failures, because otherwise you've not made money. Yeah. And so that's the challenge. That's the big difficulty with the economics of drug discovery and drug development.
It is striking how science is closely related to economics. We had that chat in the interval. I said to you, we don't choose how or whether we pay taxes or not, and we don't choose where the tax money goes. The government can take the money and launch wars, right? But the government chooses, supposedly wisely, which medication to fund. Should we be understanding or angry about this? What attitude should we take sensibly? I can imagine if I have a dying relative or friend who had a chance to get a new medication and they couldn't, that year or few months, that the government thinks it's not worth it to spend the money, that's now very, very personal to me, and I wouldn't like it.
I think that's a really difficult, complex, emotional question, and it's one that we grapple with as doctors in the pharmaceutical industry. No, that's not true. We grapple with it, whatever our role is within the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry, in my experience, I know it sometimes gets a bit of a bad reputation, but it is full of people, as the healthcare system is, as government is. People shout at politicians, but politicians have got a really difficult job to do, making difficult choices. People shout at their doctors sometimes because they can't get an appointment on a Monday morning, and doctors have got a difficult job to do in difficult circumstances. And the pharmaceutical industry is no different. All bits of our healthcare system face this challenge of... Now, I have philosophically in my lifetime, I've always approached the issue of medicines access from the perspective that you may not be happy with the price you eventually get, but as long as you're not losing money on it, I think it costs a certain amount to manufacture, maintain a license, do all that stuff. So there is actually a bare minimum price that for any pharmaceutical company is the price at which they will make a profit on that actual medicine. So if you think about it, what you're trying to do is not just make a profit on that medicine. What you're trying to do is make a profit on the medicine and recover all of the costs of all the failed medicines that have gone on along the way. So the reason a medicine doesn't cost, so if you've got a medicine, it costs a certain amount to manufacture it, it costs a certain amount to package it, it costs a certain amount to ship it from one place to another, it costs a certain amount to maintain the regulatory license each year, it costs a certain amount to have the staff to do all of these processes and make sure all of this happens. So there is a point where you break even on that drug, a price where you break even on that drug, just on the manufacturing and processing costs. You call your cost of goods. And then there is an ambition on what we want in terms of profit from that medicine to cover all of the other R&D costs where we've not managed to make a successful medicine, where we've taken something all the way through to the end of phase 2, spent quite a lot of money on it, and and a safety signal's come up or something's happened that's made us realize actually this one won't be successful. So as a company, you're trying to be profitable so that we can continue to invest in discovery science, so that we can continue to invest in finding the next medicine and the next medicine and the next medicine. And that's why sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you've invented something and it's effective, but the cost that you need to charge is more than the system is willing to pay. And ultimately, how much more, how much less is a matter of judgment for the company. What are you willing to accept? Some might be willing to accept a little bit over your cost of goods because then you're making some profit from that medicine. As long as you're making some profit, I think you can justify it. You need lots of medicines that you're making some profit from, but nonetheless. But sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where actually the cost that the government's asking you for is you'll be making a loss.
Yeah,
and you don't have a choice but to walk away in those situations. And
Yes.
I think should you be angry or should you be accepting of it? I had a really difficult discussion recently with someone from a rare diseases charity. And we were talking about the challenge of trying to find cures for young children with very, very rare diseases and what governments are willing to pay for those people. And it is difficult. I mean, you should get a politician on to ask these questions. That's what you should definitely do. What are you willing?
They're not going to answer. Never going to get an answer.
Get an ex-politician on. Find someone. But I think it is a really interesting societal question, because if you spend £2 million on a child with a very rare condition and save that child's life, it may mean that you close an accident in an emergency department somewhere and someone else dies from a stab wound. And that's the difficulty. What the government is trying to do, and I understand it, what the government is trying to do, I think, is create a healthcare system that with the money it's got available to it, and whether it's got the right amount of money available to it, whether it thinks about, the pharmaceutical industry is a little bit more than just, we've talked earlier, by rewarding innovation, by paying more for medicines, the hope is that you will also get economic advantage. So the pharmaceutical company will employ more people, and these tend to be quite highly paid people, so they pay quite a lot of tax. So you make money from them. They'll bring research into the country, and when you bring research into the country, you directly contribute money into the healthcare system. So there is a balance for government about drugs. Drugs shouldn't just be about the question of cost effectiveness within the healthcare system. They should be about what reward do I get for what benefits do I get economically for rewarding this innovation? What is the pharmaceutical industry willing to spend, to deliver into the healthcare, into the economy as a consequence of us paying more for medicines? Are they going to go and do their research in a different country because that other country is willing to pay more? And we've seen recently a number of companies pull quite big investment plans from the UK because they're saying it's because we don't reward innovation in this way. So, £1 billion research facilities have been pulled from BMS, AstraZeneca, others have pulled large scale investment, and they would argue that if we were paying more for medicines and we were rewarding innovation more, they would put that investment in. So it is a little more complicated with medicines, but the basic question, how much money am I going to put into the healthcare system? And what can I get for that money in terms of saving lives there's a balance then between the individual with an incredibly rare life-threatening disease, the treatment for which would cost a fortune, versus the 20 nurses or the accident and emergency department or whatever it is that the opportunity cost. We don't have infinite money, so you've got to make choices.
Yeah, you've actually answered a number of the questions that I had. But hearing you explaining things like that to me, maybe the real answer is honesty, not anger or acceptance. The clarity about how and why decisions are made, because we don't receive lots of explanation about these decisions, right? And you answered another question of mine about the dilemma of how to make the UK open for research and development, and at the same time making drugs or keeping drugs affordable. You said to me now that this might be challenging and we're driving away capital and scientists out of the UK. Now, when there is a new drug, no one is sure whether it's going to find its way to the market, whether the NHS will take it, or whether it's going to be there long term. Let's say you have a 10-minute meeting with the health minister, a casual, like informal sit. What's the one thing that you would ask the government to do to help move new drugs and new treatments and bring them closer to patients?
Oh, that's a great question.
Without compromising safety.
No, sure. We can get into a discussion or an argument about NICE, about speed of NICE, about the regulator. But I understand the decisions that have been taken there and the choices the government makes. What I find frustrating, I think, is when you've been through all of that process and you've got a new medicine, it's considered to be beneficial, a good safety benefit profile. It's considered an effective medicine. It's gone through NICE and it's considered a cost-effective medicine. So it's considered to be a good use of NHS resources. And we see really slow uptake, patchy uptake, geographical variation. When I rewrote the research strategy at Prostate Cancer UK in 2019, when I was head of research there, I went out and I spoke to a whole bunch of people about, doctors, patients, patient advocates, trustees, staff, all sorts of people. What do you want to see in our new research strategy? What should we be focusing on? What do you want us to try and achieve? What should we be clearly aiming for? And it was a wonderful experience. And I remember Professor Robert Jones in Glasgow said to me, it doesn't really matter what else you discover now. The biggest difference you could make as a charity is to ensure that we optimally utilise all the things that we already know. And that, I think, is one of the really big challenges. How do we optimally utilise, whenever you do any audit of any intervention, of any technology, of any innovation within the healthcare system, you will find patchy uptake. And you'll often find patchy uptake that people don't appreciate. We did a really interesting audit on a medicine for prostate cancer. We discovered it was not, and it prolonged life, and we discovered it was not being used optimally within the healthcare system.
Optimally? What does that mean?
Just 100% of eligible patients should be getting it, and it was about 30%. Okay. So lots of people weren't receiving this medicine who should have been and who could stand to benefit. And one of my very good friends said, I immediately thought, that's nonsense. I don't believe that for a second. I'm using it on all the patients. And he went off and audited and discovered he was actually almost banged in the centre. He was completely shocked. And you have this sort of recall bias, I think. He genuinely believed he was using it in every patient. And when we audited it and showed that he wasn't, he went off and audited his own figures and discovered he also wasn't. And immediately said, right, okay, I really need to be thinking about this. And so I think there is a challenge for diffusion of innovation into the healthcare system. I think that's the one thing I would say. How do we incentivize police? Maybe not the right word, but how do we incentivize optimal use of, and it's not just medicines, it's diagnostics, it's devices, it's surgical techniques, it's psychotherapy, it's mental health intervention, it's crisis relief, it's public health, it's all sorts of things. How do we, once we find something that's transformational, that's innovative, that's really going to deliver health benefits. How do we make sure everyone has access to that? How do we democratize healthcare and make sure everyone benefits?
We touched on rare diseases, and you've also highlighted that an increasing number of medicines for rare diseases aren't even being launched in the UK. Why is that? Why would a pharma company choose not to launch in the UK?
I think because of the cost effectiveness argument. I think simply because they feel they won't get the right price for the complexity of the medicine. I mean, often it's because manufacturing process, regulatory process, setting up an affiliate, particularly if you're a small company with a rare disease area, and quite often these are quite small companies, the amount of money you would need to put in to have an infrastructure in the UK to manage that medicine requires that your medicine is reimbursed at a certain level. And if it's not reimbursable, or there isn't an expertise widespread throughout the healthcare system that you think you're going to get consistent uptake, then you may just decide not to launch.
So again, families are missing out. It's not because the science fails, but because of the system. Does that mean that we're now exporting innovation because of economics?
There's always a balance. I think that's true, generally speaking. I mean, I think ultimately innovation eventually filters down. I think, if you, I mean, it's often more of a delay to innovation than a absence of it. But yeah, I mean, all innovation takes a bit of, yes.
Difficult questions.
No, I think I'm trying to give a more upbeat, more positive answer. But I think there are a number of reasons why innovation doesn't make it into the hands of patients quickly, and only some of it's economics. I mean, then most medicines that get put through NICE get approved by NICE. Most medicines get submitted to NICE. I think it is a problem in complex therapies for rare diseases, true.
Because they serve a tiny population.
Because it's a tiny population and because they're very expensive to manufacture. So cell and gene therapies for very rare diseases, they're challenging to invent, they're challenging to make. And ultimately you've got a relatively small group of people who benefit from them. So that is challenging. But I mean, I'm really hopeful. If you think about innovation, pace of technology, simplification of processes, when we first sequenced a genome, it took, I can't remember, millions of pounds and millions of hours to sequence the first genome, the first genome project, right? Now you can sequence a genome in a couple of hours for a couple of £100.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So there is this adoption cost curve, and I think that will apply to quite a lot of this innovation. I mean, is that a compensation for you if your child is affected by it now? I think that is one of the real difficulties, that we will always be able to look back. My mum has just been diagnosed with dementia relatively recently, and she will die of her dementia, with or of her dementia. And in my lifetime, I expect we will understand the causes of dementia and be much better able to prevent it. Treatment of dementia, I'm a little bit more cynical about. I do worry that the cause of dementia is going to make it difficult to treat or reverse.
What do you mean, please?
Brains are not like skin or bones or liver. Brain damage is quite difficult to reverse. I am slightly worried that the real breakthrough for dementia will be really understanding why it happens and stopping it from happening. If you think about the real breakthrough with cardiac disease, the real reason we see we've got so much better outcomes for people from heart disease isn't because we've got very good at treating heart attacks. I mean, sure, we save lives, we've got good at that. But when someone's had a heart attack, you've kind of failed. And if they have a second heart attack and go on to get heart failure, really much you can do. Lots of these people end up with heart failure and they eventually die of the disease. The real success has been understanding blood pressure and cholesterol and all these other elements, and intervening with with effective medicines that can lower blood pressure, can lower cholesterol. We've understood the effect of smoking. We've stopped people smoking to a greater extent. And so the battle on cardiovascular disease has been prevention rather than cure. It's why it's completely right that it's one of the 3 pillars of Wes Streeting's NHS plan. So I do worry with things like dementia that it'll be a prevention issue. I'm rambling slightly. The point I was making is...
It's all valid.
The point I was making is that at some stage, we will know how to have stopped my mum getting dementia. And it will always have been too late for her because she's got quite advanced dementia now. And I think that's the nature of medical progress. It will always come too late for some people. And I think that's sad in some ways. But for me, I don't look to my parents and think, how do we innovate there? You've had people on with longevity research, and I understand they're fascinated about how we keep old people alive for much longer. What I aspire to is a world where my children have better outcomes, better health outcomes, better economic prosperity, healthier, wealthier, and happier than I was. Happier than I was might not be a difficult thing to achieve at times. But that's a whole different pod. That's an Alain de Botton podcast, I think. But that's what I aspire to. And so I think when we get up every morning and think about healthcare innovation and trying to make a difference, I think we're thinking about as much as we can making it better for our children. The thing that I always try to strive for is equity, wherever I can. I think we have this really challenging situation. We have free of charge programs in industry, lots of free of charge programs, where for one reason or another, we'll make a medicine available free of charge. Doctors can request a medicine on an individual name patient basis. There's lots of sort of frameworks for this, but I've always tried to ensure that we have consistency and equity when we do of access, when we do these sorts of programs. So I've always been of the view that you collect data, you demonstrate that the medicine's effective.
Yes.
You submit it to the regulator. You may decide that you're comfortable giving a medicine away free for a period of time between regulatory approval and reimbursement by NICE, but only if you're comfortable that you're definitely going to get through NICE. So if you're going into NICE not sure that you're going to get through, or you've got a walk away moment and it's marginal, I think it's my personal view, and I know people disagree with me. People will say anyone who gets access to medicine that's beneficial, it's useful. But I think this question we talked to earlier is a really, really important one. We've got a framework and a process, and I think, how do you make the decision that some people deserve that free drug and others don't? That equity question for me is really, really critically important. So if I'm making something available a little earlier, knowing that I'm definitely going to get through NICE and it's definitely going to get reimbursed, then I'm fine with that. But if I would introduce, and we talked a little bit about this in Germany, if I'm going to introduce a medicine into the UK free of charge and give it to some people for a period of time, and then I'm going to take it away because I don't get the price I need at NICE to make it economically viable, I really, really worry about that. And so I've always been sort of driven by, there's a process. Let's do what's required in the process. Let's put the medicines through the process. Let's have the regulator and reimbursement agencies make a decision, then let's get the medicine to patients as quickly as we can. And I think all the other sort of frameworks around it, they're challenging. They come with some sort of moral and ethical dilemma. To whom does one say yes? At what point is the evidence base sufficient? At what point? Because you can do harm, right? If you give a medicine in someone which hasn't been through the process and they have a side effect and you do some harm, then you've kind of not followed the process. That does worry me.
I am curious now about the economics of rare disease treatments. How do companies price drugs for tiny populations?
It's a great question. With any medicine pricing in any company, and it may vary from company to company depending on how big you are. Clearly, if you're Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer, you've got more economic flexibility than if you're a biotech with one medicine. So if you're a biotech with one medicine, then that medicine has to pay for itself.
Yes.
You have to recover everything you've invested in that during the development program and make a profit on your manufacturing. So your price will and give a promised return of investment to your investors and various others, and pay all your salaries and do all the other things that's required. Pfizer or a Johnson & Johnson might be better able to say, well, we've launched a medicine for blood pressure and it's done phenomenally well, and it's made a huge profit for us, and that allows us to be more able to release a medicine for rare diseases at a more affordable price. So I think it depends, but ultimately what companies are trying to do is build innovation in a sustainable way for the future, not just in that immediate disease, but across all diseases. They need to attract investment from shareholders. People need to buy the shares. And that can be venture capitalists, but it can also be big pension funds and all those other sorts of things that we've maybe talked about. And that's the framework for any individual medicine.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a complex series of considerations.
Yeah. You mentioned that you worked on the Cancer Drug Fund to decide which cancer treatments should be introduced to the NHS. Could you share with us one of the biggest challenges that you faced there?
The biggest challenge on the Cancer Drugs Fund, I think, was that it was a new process that was different from what we'd seen before. And we had to create something that felt equitable. So the promise of the Cancer Drugs Fund was that it would fund all cancer medicines. We will fund cancer medicines was Cameron's election slogan in 2010. And I think there was an expectation from industry that would mean everything would be funded, and it would be funded at list price. I think there was an expectation from patients that everything would be funded.
That's quite ambitious.
Yeah. Yeah.
To put it nicely.
Cameron is ambitious. You know, I was in a meeting with him relatively recently. He's very interested in rare diseases because of course his son unfortunately passed away having been born with a rare disease. And Cameron did some amazing things. You know, he introduced Genomics England. He introduced the Cancer Drugs Fund. He talk about what on earth the legacy was of the Conservatives over the last 14 years. Actually, some of the things Cameron did on health probably feature quite high up the list of legacy of the Conservatives over the last 14 years. So he does quite a lot of credit for that. But there was huge expectation on the Cancer Drugs Fund and not huge amounts of money, actually. And so it was delivering as well as we could against as many people's expectations as we could. Yeah. Personally, for me, the challenge was trying to please two masters. So I sat on the Cancer Drugs Fund. My purpose there was to provide an industry view into how it should operate optimally. Yeah. But when I came back to the ABPI to sit in amongst my industry peers, I also had to provide a Cancer Drugs Fund view on why it couldn't always do what industry wanted it to. So it was almost a sort of ambassadorial role where in one audience you're trying to, and it's fascinating because you never get to please anyone. So had my industry colleagues seen how hard I fought for industry interests when I was sitting with my Cancer Drugs Fund colleagues, I think they would have had a different view. Had my Cancer Drugs Fund colleagues seen how hard I fought for their interests when sitting in front of my industry peers, I actually think they did understand that. But I think they would have had a different view. The problem is you only get to be the bad guy.
Yes, when you think about the delays that stop new cancer medicines from reaching people, where does the real blockage happen all through the change from approval to medications being in the hand of patients? Where is the blockage and how would you reshape that moment?
Sometimes there is no blockage.
It's just a process.
So sometimes you watch a medicine just fly through the system. It gets regulatory approval quickly because you've collected good evidence. It gets reimbursement quickly because you've collected good evidence and the company's come with a realistic price. I think both of those things probably reassure people that it's an effective use of resources and it's a good medicine.
The science behind it.
And so and maybe you have a well-resourced, fairly expert therapy area, and as a consequence of that, the uptake is excellent, and you find yourself sort of a year and a half down the line, and the medicine is being used by most of the patients that it should be used by, and it's been very successful. I think other areas where it's more of a challenge are maybe where some of those evidential elements are less convincing to doctors. Or it's a great question, because I don't know. I think we sit around sometimes and wonder why some medicines just get used the way they're supposed to and others don't. And it can vary from therapy area to therapy area, but it's often it can sometimes be a lack of clinical buy-in, despite all the evidence. Maybe there are things about the evidence package that some people are worried about, and finding that out, hearing that, communicating with people about why that is a real core part of what I used to do, or do. Sometimes it's a system challenge. So one of the real problems with innovation is that they can break an existing system. So if you look back at kidney cancer 20 years ago, there were really no treatments for kidney cancer. In lots of people, it was quite a benign, long-term condition. It grew slowly. They didn't die of it. And people thought about these patients because I think the clinicians, the people who came and went quite quickly, didn't stick in clinicians' minds. It was the people who'd been coming to their clinic for 15 years with the same kidney cancer that they got to know that they really thought of. So that was these were the emblematic patients. There were a couple of therapies, high-dose interferon, interleukin-2, Christie in Manchester and Barts in London in particular had proponents of those, and if you went there you might get given those treatments, but generally speaking they were hard to give, quite high toxicity rates, and so people were very selective about who they gave those kinds of treatments to. So generally speaking, these were a group of patients. It wasn't a massively common disease. They weren't being given treatments, typically sort of watch and wait approach. And so we were managing them often at the end of prostate cancer clinics. So you would have prostate cancer, really common disease, 50,000 people a year, 50,000 people a year in the UK, very, very common disease. And kidney cancer, 5,000 or 6,000 people a year, much, much less common disease. And typically they would be treated by the same doctors. But you would do a big prostate clinic, see all of your prostate patients who've got lots of different treatment options available to them. And then you would keep an eye on your kidney cancer patients at the end of the clinic. And in quite close succession, a couple of companies invented new medicines for kidney cancer. And then over the next 5 or 6 years, there's probably 7 or 8 new medicines for kidney cancer have come on stream. There are lots of different treatment options now. And suddenly, the people who had passed away quite quickly weren't passing away so quickly. So the numbers in the clinic started to grow. And they had side effects. These medicines had side effects. There were side effects that we'd never seen before, difficult side effects, completely different from the side effects that prostate cancer drugs were causing. And so they were quite complex and time-consuming to manage. So all of a sudden, you've got a few people coming at the end of the prostate cancer clinic who are easy to manage, to lots and lots of patients with complex side effects. And you have to completely restructure your care path. You have to build dedicated clinics. You have to train dedicated specialist nurses. You have to have dedicated specialist pharmacists who understand this. So there's a whole process of introducing, true innovation, as opposed to, quite a lot of what we do is iterative. So something's quite good and something comes along that's a bit better, but it doesn't fundamentally shift the game. But every now and then you get something that fundamentally shifts the game and increases the amount of patients and increases the complexity of managing those people. And it takes a long time for the healthcare system to adapt to that. Very often, the early adopters go through all of the pain. Yes. And some people will say, honestly, I think some people say this is going to be really, really super complicated for us to introduce this. I'm going to just keep doing what I always did because I believe it works. I think people know that it doesn't, but I think they're just resource constrained, busy, lack of money, difficult situations. And so it takes a bit longer for these to diffuse through the system. So that's one thing I think we could get better at is really challenging, because there's a limit to what the industry can do before something's got a license. So going and proactively discussing these challenges ahead of a marketing authorization could be seen as pre-license promotion, which is not allowed. But we do sit around in various industry fora and say, what could we be doing earlier to better prepare the system for this kind of innovation? That's a really important question, because if you genuinely believe it's going to make a difference, if you genuinely believe it's going to save lives or prolong lives or improve quality of life, then the equity issue, you should be getting it to everyone as soon as you can, I think.
Would you say that cancer research in the UK is fragmented? And this is not my word, I read it somewhere. Is there a way to make it cohesive if you do agree with this statement?
I think everything is fragmented, if you think about it, because we don't have a single organisation or entity with a single strategic vision.
Is this a good thing or?
Well, if you think about it, so let's look at prostate cancer, for example. Cancer Research UK will do quite a lot of research in prostate cancer. They'll fund some work there. Prostate Cancer UK will fund research. Prostate Cancer Foundation will fund research in the US. Prostate Cancer Research Centre, whatever it's called, is another charity. So you've got a whole handful of charities, lots of groups who are funding individual innovation. There'll be lots of academic centres who are doing research in various situations within prostate cancer. You will have lots of companies doing drug discovery and trying to find medicines. You'll have surgeons doing surgical research. You'll have diagnostics companies doing diagnostic research. You'll have theranostic companies doing theranostic research. You'll have at any one time screening trials ongoing, asking different questions about early diagnosis or early detection. And there isn't, we did in the UK used to have something called the National Cancer Research Institute. And I think the NCRI had study groups for various different cancers. I think they did quite a good coordinating job of trying as best as they could to ensure that the clinical research we were doing was coherent and cohesive. It's a really interesting question. I'd love to see and debate philosophically, do we make progress as humanity from all sitting in a committee and agreeing what we're going to do? Or do we make progress by lots of people trying things and having different ideas and competing almost to find the right answer? I
think the second option.
I think the second option. So
sense.
Fragmentation in research, sure, it may end up feeling like it's not coordinated and we're not all pulling in the same direction, but it increases the likelihood that someone's going to find something that other people wouldn't have found. So I'd love to hear the background to that comment, and there will be lots of things you can criticise about us being less coordinated than perhaps we could be. But by a similar token, I think human progress has always been a bit messy.
Assisted dying, that's a very problematic terrain. Hopefully I'm not oversimplifying this by just asking one question, but when politicians debate assisted dying, what do everyone overlook or miss on an ethical or moral perspective?
It's a really good question. So, I mean, I was, I guess, uniquely close to the assisted dying bill. I've written a couple of articles on it and discussed it in detail with some of the bill committee. And I would say nothing. So what was overlooked, I would say nothing. I think it's a complicated and difficult topic, but I do feel that it got taken seriously. I think it's probably far too complicated and difficult and controversial an issue to be a private member's bill. I think the way that it was dealt with through Parliament, so for those who don't know the arcanery of British politics and how it all works, most of what goes through Parliament is decided by government and run by ministers with civil servants. And when they try and write laws and bills, they have quite a lot of support and time and expertise. A backbench bill is introduced. A private member's bill is introduced by an individual MP It therefore typically gets much less time for debate, much less time for scrutiny, somewhat less support from the civil service and government machinery. And I think this is probably one of the most controversial things that will be discussed in Parliament during this time. It was introduced very early on. So if you think back to 2024 general election, it was a seismic shift in Parliament. I think there was something like 300 or 350 new MPs. So there are 650 MPs. So you've got a whole bunch of people, half the Commons, who've never been there before. They're trying to set their offices up. They're trying to recruit staff. They're trying to work out how you vote in a lobby, where you go for coffee. Lots going on, huge amounts going on. And we introduced one of the most emotionally charged topics in one of the least well-supported ways into the thick of that discussion. And I think that's a real challenge. Now, the Bill Committee, when they were writing the bill, did take a huge amount of evidence. I think there were a number of debates in Parliament which were well attended and where most people, I mean, there were occasional comments and some slightly emotional, slightly charged language at times, but I think most people, Parliament is often accused of being a bit of a social media trap. So people will tell me, you don't get proper debate in the chamber. People don't like to ask questions because it's televised. And so you've got to, you go into the chamber, you say something and then you sit down. And so there's not a proper debate. But I actually think this was a topic on which people did challenge and discuss and think about the ethical issues. And it is incredibly difficult. I mean, I think there was a balance between people were trying to weigh up the challenges of suffering in end-of-life care with the risks of people feeling coerced or forced into making a decision that they didn't want to make. And I think that is very, very difficult. And the scope of it is difficult. Who should be allowed assisted dying? What we've ended up with is a bill which allows people to seek assisted dying in the last 6 months of life. How you determine who's got 6 months to live is an interesting question. But actually, are those the people who are least well served by our healthcare system? Are those the people who are most in need and suffering? And you'll hear advocates of assisted dying saying, when you've got a dreadful life-limiting condition with significant impact on your quality of life, but you've got another 10 years to go, it's going to be a long-term condition, motor neuron disease, multiple sclerosis towards the end stages, Alzheimer's. There's a whole bunch of conditions where you're not going to die quickly, but your quality of life could be significantly altered, impaired. I think all of these issues came up. I think the challenge for me is the format in which it was discussed and the time it was discussed. And I wonder, we've not heard much about assisted dying. It was passed at the second reading, so it should become law and be implemented. But I haven't really seen very much since in terms of progress through the rest of the process. And maybe I could be corrected on that. But I do just wonder if this might be something that, having been voted through, whether we actually ever see it mounted into legislation or not. That's going to be a really interesting question, one to keep an eye on. For me, I think it needed a royal commission. I would have asked an independent body to go off and really think about it and make some really comprehensive recommendations. Yeah. Because I think what's going to happen, if it does make the statute books, I think if this bill makes the statute books, I think it will get contested significantly through the courts, and I think it will be changed substantially by that process. It is also a quirk of our political system that the Scots, the people who still live in Scotland, I'm a Scot of course, but I live in England now. I'm doing something quite interesting psychologically, but Scotland, Holyrood is currently also debating assisted dying, and there's a bill going through the Scottish Parliament. I'm not quite as clear on where that is, but it could end up being quite a different bill. And so you could end up, because of the nature of our political system, with two very different legal frameworks around assisted dying in two different countries. And that's quite interesting. You don't want, I don't think, inconsistency between Scotland and England on such a charged and difficult issue.
Yes, and I can imagine patients moving territory to get access to whatever.
I think that's a really interesting question. So I think if you have a bill which has a different framework in Scotland, for example, if Scotland doesn't have a 6-month life expectancy limit, if it allows people with chronic terminal conditions, both bills had a requirement on how long you lived in the country, which was quite interesting. So you had to be resident in Scotland for 12 months or more to avail yourself of the legislation. But what you could foresee is people with life-limiting long-term conditions, very expensive, complex social needs, moving to Scotland, living there for 12 months, then seeking assisted dying under the Scottish rules, for example. And they would be a huge burden to the Scottish healthcare system during that time. Scotland's a much smaller country, much smaller health budget. So I think the moral and ethical questions were well debated in Parliament. I think the thing that for me that was missing, I think, was some of the more practical issues.
Clinical trials, we explored this a little bit, but we want to dive a little bit deeper. And please correct me if I'm wrong. The Cancer Drugs Fund uses a system where a patient's treatment can essentially be the trial. And this supposedly speeds access to new treatments and drugs. How do patients react when we tell them this medication has potential, it gives you hope, but we're not quite sure about it and we're collecting data from your usage? Are there any medical or even moral complications here?
No. Yes, there are considerations. People are very, for the most part, I think, very willing to involve themselves in clinical research. I think we've got, generally speaking, it's interesting because there's been quite a lot of controversy over the last few years with COVID and various other things, but I think generally speaking, people are still fairly trusting of their healthcare professionals, I think. Very generous with their time. Fairly altruistic, I think, certainly in the UK. And the really key thing about research is that you explain it to people and make sure they're in a position of understanding what they're agreeing to. I think that's really critically important, and therefore that they have a choice. Their care. One of the really underpinning principles of doing any research is that the care that someone gets, if they say no, should not be compromised by that. They should still get the best care. It is challenging. Sometimes you have a clinical trial where if there's nothing reimbursed in the healthcare system for treating that disease, if something's been declined by NICE and you want to run a trial and the company is going to pay for the drug that was declined by NICE and a new innovative medicine, then there is a challenge that if you say no to the trial, you don't get any treatment. If you say yes to the trial, you get one of two treatments, one of which may be better than the other, but at least... So there are some challenging moral and ethical questions sometimes around introducing trials where you've got imperfect access to existing drugs. But generally speaking, if you speak to people, they are extremely happy to participate in research, whether it benefits themselves or not, even if it finds out things that will benefit other people in the future. I think that's one of the things I find amazing about human nature, is that people are very willing, generally speaking, to as long as they're not going to be too disadvantaged or out of pocket or whatever, suffer harm, very willing to involve themselves in things that will ultimately benefit the wider population, the wider society.
I've also heard of those flexible deals between the NHS and pharma companies. They're called pay only if it works. Could you explain this one for us, please? When do these deals make sense for the NHS and pharma companies at the same time?
Yeah, so payment by results, there's various other ways of phrasing it. So you may... And again, they're usually a way of dealing with a degree of uncertainty. So
when you say uncertainty, you mean that the NHS...
we're not sure whether the medicine's going to work quite as well as we thought.
Okay, they're not sure about its effectiveness.
Yeah, that's usually... so a payment by results type system is... So if the NHS is absolutely certain what the benefit of the medicine is going to be and can approve it at a cost-effective price, then you usually just get routine commissioning. Sometimes there's a bit of uncertainty. You don't know who's going to benefit. It may be quite a quick binary situation. So a drug, I mean, an ideal candidate for this kind of thing would be a medicine that you can tell within 1 or 2 doses whether it's going to work or not.
That's quick, right?
So that would be a really interesting candidate. So you know, anyone that you give the medicine to and it doesn't work, you stop giving them the medicine and they don't pay for that treatment. Anyone that you give the medicine to and it does work, they keep getting it and they keep paying for it. So that would be one example where you end up, you know, if you end up with the only medicine you pay for is that you've given to patients and it's worked. But there are lots of different ways of creating schemes and processes for managing cost effectiveness. They're all really about managing risk, really fundamentally. They're all really about, is this treatment cost effective or not? We're not quite sure. What are we going to do to mitigate the risk to the NHS of spending money on something that turns out not to be?
COVID vaccines were tested in diverse populations very quickly. This is the power of a system in crisis. What did that process do right that can be replicated in other conditions?
Gosh, lots has been spoken about the COVID vaccination program, and I'm not expert by any means in the COVID vaccination program. So I speak as a scientifically educated amateur rather than an insider.
That's good enough.
But what I would say we did very well. The urgency of the situation concentrated people's minds on what bits of process and bureaucracy were really necessary and what bits weren't. So I think we had brilliant dialogue between the regulators and the companies. We had brilliant dialogue between researchers, academics, and the pharmaceutical industry. So there was great communication, great teamwork, a risk proportionate regulatory approach, iterative, a good real world evidence collection, good pharmacovigilance. We recognised that we wanted to keep an eye on these vaccines and make sure that they were working and weren't causing side effects. We were good at that. The rollout was incredibly effective. I think that was a sort of great national success from a sort of logistical organisational point of view. People pulled together and volunteered. There was a great sort of outpouring of goodwill, I think. We reduced our constraints over data use, so it can be quite difficult to get access to data and use data. We really removed quite a lot of the barriers to data use within the system in order to, you know, there was an urgency. And many of us had hoped that that would result in a more flexible, more risk proportionate system on a permanent basis. I think some of our sort of previous bureaucratic approaches have crept back in again, and safety and data protection, all these other things. I understand it, but it did show. I mean, it was actually incredible. We don't think about it, but if you think back, I was deeply, deeply desolate at the beginning of COVID because I couldn't see a way back to normality, and I would say that affected some quite big decisions I made in my life, because I saw this through the lens of previous pandemics and previous crises. If you look back at the great flu outbreaks of 1918, 50s and 60s, huge numbers of people died. And it took a long time. In the 1918 flu pandemic, they're uncertain, but possibly over 100 million people died of flu. And we're still dying of flu 3 years later. I mean, it was an absolute catastrophe. And COVID was over really quite quickly.
Relatively,
in the scheme of things.
When you look at history.
The immediate crisis, of course, we still live with COVID today, but the immediate crisis and the deaths from COVID were on a historical scale. Every death. I mean, it was awful and it was traumatic, and the world will never quite be the same again. People of my generation, particularly, will never quite be the same again. Our children who were locked down had major psychological issues. People lost friends and family, but oh my goodness, it could have been so much worse.
Yes, now we can see that.
Was.
Yeah, absolutely. David, you moved from the charity sector to pharma?
Because of COVID.
Because of COVID, yeah. What
Interestingly.
surprised you? What surprised you or shocked you the most about the difference? And why did you venture into that move?
So I started my career in medicine, in surgery. I then moved to Pfizer, and I spent 11 years at Pfizer. 11 incredibly happy years. Loved my time at Pfizer. Did amazing things. I will always be very, very fond of those 11 years of Pfizer. I then moved to the charity sector and to Prostate Cancer UK. I spent 18 months there and left. Again, COVID hit and the charities had real challenges with cash flow. We had people on furlough. We needed to cut jobs, and I'll be honest, we had a plan in my organisation. We'd been asked to think about what we would do in the event of a financial crisis. And I had said in the September before, long before COVID had even remotely come across anyone's radar, I had written my plan for what my department would do in the face of a financial crisis, and it was get rid of me. I was there as a innovative leader. I was there as a strategist. I was trying to think big about how we did innovation and how we did research differently. And in the face of having no money, it didn't make a lot of sense to be paying my salary to not do that. And I had two people in my team who were very good. I'd been working with one of them to take over from me. And in the face of an immediate crisis, I thought keeping them and their operational leadership and getting rid of me was the thing to do. So COVID hit, and I slightly regretted the plan written in the in the face of not believing that it would happen, and then we are 4 months later having to implement this plan. So I have a real sadness. I look back, real sadness that my time at Prostate Cancer UK came to an end in the way it did. Actually, I'm really it was not how I would have wanted it to finish. I'm glad of the decisions I took. I'm pleased for the guys who stayed behind, but nonetheless, what did I find different? I was, I guess, a little surprised to see so little difference.
Really?
Yeah. Pfizer was a well-run, well-structured, multi-department organisation, clear vision what it wanted to achieve, clearly delineated responsibilities on who was trying to achieve which bits of that, with a very good governance structure, an excellent governance structure. And I went to Prostate Cancer UK. Pfizer was 100,000 people globally. Prostate Cancer UK was 200 people. So clearly the scale was different. But it was a well-organised, well-run, multi-department organisation, clear on what it was trying to achieve, with all the different departments contributing effectively to that and doing their role in the way that they should be, and with an excellent governance structure.
Yeah.
And it was just, frankly, it was they were two professional organizations trying to make things better for patients. Now, were they different? Of course they were different. There were differences. I mean, Prostate Cancer UK wasn't trying to make a profit. Pfizer was. Prostate Cancer UK didn't have shareholders. Pfizer did. But Prostate Cancer UK had stakeholders. They had donors. They had people that they needed to please. They were doing things. They were both trying to manage their stakeholders and their financial contributors in different ways. So, I was remarkably surprised by the consistency. And in any one individual, if you took anyone that I'd worked with at Pfizer, anyone that I worked with at Prostate Cancer UK, and you briefed them not to tell you which organisation, but just to have a top-level conversation about what they did for a living, I would challenge you to work out who was from which organisation. There was a real commitment to, I think, generally speaking, a real commitment to trying to make a difference to patients.
Yeah, it's funny because seemingly they look like they have two completely different mission. Yeah.
Very consistent mission statements, very consistent approach to mission as well.
Okay. And when you moved from being a surgeon to be part of a pharmaceutical company, have you ever received criticism from colleagues who thought that you were going corporate?
No, I haven't. I think a lot of people don't understand what I do. So I joined the medical department at Pfizer, and I know I met a number of people. I lived in Glasgow, and so I saw colleagues from university. A number of people I didn't know that or hadn't spoken to in a while, had been friends with previously, bumped into in the street, whatever. The line that I used to get a lot at the beginning was, "I hear you've gone to be a sales representative."
Sorry to laugh, but this is funny.
No.
Funny.
I mean,
this is part of the misconceptions about pharmaceutical doctors, right?
I think it is completely rooted in the misconception that all bits of the system have about all the other bits of the system. You know, at the pharmaceutical industry, we see patient groups as a homogenous group. And patient groups are not homogenous entities. Charities are not homogenous entities. They've got corporate affairs teams. They've got communications teams. They've got research strategists. They've got HR departments. They've got fundraisers. They're a company. I spoke at conferences all around the world. We fundamentally changed how we care for women. And not just in that setting, but actually it really fundamentally shifted the way we think about follow-up care in oncology, cancer generally. Not single-handedly, but we were a really big part of it. BMJ and the breast and British Journal of Surgery, really, really high impact factor journals. I love writing. One of my sort of passions is writing, and it was just such a buzz finding something out, understanding what it was going to do to the healthcare system if you could implement this new knowledge and change the way we did things, writing it down, sending it into a journal, seeing it in public. I mean, you don't see it in paper anymore very often. You know, see it online, but they would send me a physical journal with my paper in it, David Montgomery, and it was incredibly addictive.
Yeah, and the pride.
And I became had I stayed in medicine, I would have been an academic surgeon. I would have done research all my career because I fell in love with it. And so we fundamentally shifted the way we think about training. So it was a real shame. I got stuck, thought it would be, I could see how hard it was going to be to get into a system that had changed and where there wasn't a clear route in, was amenable to the possibility of doing something different. And my wife and I did talk about going to Australia for a while. My wife's an Australian citizen and trained in Sydney. So we did talk for a long. In fact, we went to Australia 2 or 3 times. Of course, we went to see family and things, but we got into long conversations with surgical colleagues in Australia about potentially coming back out there. I think that would have been, in the absence of my wife bumping into a colleague from Pfizer at a congress and discovering that this was a route into industry and there being a job available, no less, that I could do from Glasgow. Again, some real serendipity there. In the absence of that, I think we would probably have gone to Australia at that stage.
Well, during your long time at Pfizer, were there moments where pharma priorities and patients' need felt misaligned? And how did you navigate that?
Yeah, for me, never, actually. We were very lucky, I think, at Pfizer. I joined it just as Pfizer was becoming an oncology company, and for the most part, we had some really innovative, really exciting medicines through that period, which I was really really, really pleased to be able to work on. And I never felt any tension at Pfizer, actually. I never really...
You know why I'm asking this? Because you talk about responsible innovation, which implies that you're saying that not all innovations
are responsible.
Are good innovations.
So,
give us some examples of that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not so much about, responsible innovation. I think it's just balancing risk and benefit within an innovative framework and finding things that are valuable and truly fulfill a need. I think it's about patient centricity, right? So I think if you engage in the community and you engage with patients and you understand what the challenges are and what people want from treatments, I think you'll find it is easier. I think you'll find the innovation flows from that. If you're trying to fix a defined need, very difficult for us as a company to define the need of patients. And I have seen companies with medicines that struggle. They're clinically very effective medicines, but they have challenging side effects.
Yes.
And there are diseases where patients day-to-day quality of life isn't that badly impacted by their disease for quite long periods of time, slow, indolent, autoimmune conditions, those sorts of things, but taking a medicine on a daily basis. So if you've got a disease that's gradually getting worse over a long period of time, and you're getting a little more fatigued with each passing month, with each passing year, whatever, maybe there are other side effects or symptoms of that disease coming along, but they're coming along gradually.
Yes.
You learn to cope and you learn to adapt.
That's totally me, because I have autoimmune diseases.
If someone gives you a tablet for that disease,
I might struggle more with
that
that.
causes you diarrhea,
Yeah.
an acute diarrhea, 5 or 6 times a day, you think, okay,
I don't want the drug now. I'll manage it somehow.
You don't want the drug. And I think quite a lot of people, that's a balance to strike, because you get the side effects right away, and quite often these side effects will settle over time. So I think there is some communication to be had with patients over the necessary, patience and tolerance of these. Sometimes get quite bad side effects the first 2 or 3 days, and then they settle, and the medicine in the long term slows the disease and is worth taking. So there's a dialogue to be had. Inhaled insulin is a really good example. They very early inhaled insulin. The theory was that inhaled insulin would be a more practical way of taking it than having a needle and injecting insulin, and in particular people who were needle phobic. Now, the problem is with diabetes, you get over your needle phobia quite quickly. Because if you get type 1 diabetes and you don't treat it, then you get very ill and potentially die quite quickly with something with an acute type 1 diabetes of that type. And the devices are very subtle. So insulin pens are small, they're pen-sized, they fit in a pocket, they're very discreet. You can administer your insulin sitting at a dining table with very little fuss. It's not complicated. And the very first inhaled insulin devices, the administration device was huge. It was the size of a small fire extinguisher.
Wow.
And so the uptake, Pfizer launched one of these in 2006 and withdrew it from the market in 2007 because the sales had been so poor. And that's a really interesting case of, and I think people talk about this, is a really interesting case of, I see the problem. I mean, people have subsequently released inhaled insulin with much more discreet, much more user-friendly devices, and those have been successful. Yeah. But identifying a challenge, but providing the wrong solution, and that for me is a really key element of any innovation.
Yeah, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But it seems that you're telling us now that innovation isn't automatically progress or change. Intention and impact matter.
The word innovation is judgmental.
Is it?
I think it is. One uses that word. I think there's an implication that it's not just change, but better change.
But better change, yes.
I wouldn't describe the changes to surgical training in the early 2000s as innovative. Yeah, I think they were. I mean, I can see why you might see them as being innovative, but I think what they've done didn't introduce a better system. It was quicker. It left people with less uncertainty. They knew earlier on in their career whether they'd succeeded or failed to get onto the training program of the requirement. They became a consultant sooner. But in many ways, they've had negative unintended consequences. And that I guess, that's the interesting question about change versus true innovation.
Yes. And there is an argument about who would define responsible, because responsible can be very subjective and relative. Some pharma companies might think, oh, it's legal, so it's fair play. We can do whatever we want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that. Maybe I've been lucky, maybe I've been naive, but I've never found myself in all of the companies I've worked in. People make mistakes. People are human, right? Sometimes you get things wrong. We have self-regulation in the UK, and the nature of self-regulation means that there's some greyness and some debate over individual tactics at times, but I always take it back to, would I be comfortable sitting having a conversation with my gran about what I'm about to do?
Yes.
Would I be happy that someone writes an article on it and puts it in a newspaper? And if the answer to that is yes, I'll crack on and do it.
Yeah.
If I think it's the right thing and I think it's going to make a positive difference to patients, I think I'm comfortable. Of course, it has to fulfill the requirements of the law as well. And sometimes you then say, and is this compliant with our rules and regulations? And you discover that it isn't. And you think, right, okay, what's the problem here? There's a challenge in the system, and I want to fix it because that will be better for patients. And there are rules that constrain me from doing that. Are those the correct rules? You should always look and ask yourself in any system. Quite often law and regulation is built in the teeth of catastrophe. So
Yes.
you have something goes spectacularly wrong and people go, oh my goodness, how did that happen? And they introduce regulation. And that regulation doesn't solve the problem and creates unintended consequences elsewhere. And a responsible regulator, which the MHRA absolutely is, recognises that and will say, right, okay, this is a new world. Things are different. How do we adapt? How do we fulfil the mission of safe and effective, responsible innovation in a rapidly changing environment?
What kind of actions from pharmaceutical companies that could potentially damage patients' trust, even when the science behind medicines is solid?
I think one of the really key tenets for trust is transparency. I think that's really fundamental. And it's interesting. Last week, I was at a meeting with Ben Goldacre speaking. So Ben Goldacre is an absolutely fascinating doctor. And he wrote a book many, many years ago called Bad Pharma.
Yes, I know that book. I have it. I haven't read it, but I have it.
You must read it. It's
behind you, actually.
Oh, really? It's
Yes,
an old book
yes.
now, but Bad Pharma. He's written a number of other books. It's a challenging read for someone in the pharmaceutical industry. But Ben led a campaign, and it was really fascinating because there wasn't a transparency issue. I think history would judge that there wasn't a transparency issue. But I think what there was a complacency issue.
Complacency.
So when you do science, if it doesn't work, you really should write that up and publish it. You should write it up and publish it so that other people don't make your mistakes and don't repeat the science and do harm. That's really critically important. But the reality is that it's quite difficult to publish negative studies. And, you're not going to get a phase 3 trial that's failed, published in the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet. These are places where each week they're getting thousands and thousands and thousands of applications for publications, and they're going to publish the trials that are most groundbreaking, most practice changing. And so, through no fault of their own, I think there's a journal called the Journal of Negative Studies.
That could be very useful.
Yeah, but no one reads it.
Because it's negative, yeah.
But it's useful that it's there because, people get the Lancet through the letterbox. I get the British Medical Journal, comes through my letterbox, and I sit and read it. And I read the interesting studies and I read the interesting articles because all the studies are positive, and that's fascinating. No one sits and reads the Journal of Negative Studies cover to cover.
I can
of course
imagine
they don't.
that.
But by publishing them, when you do a literature search for all the studies, they come up and they're in the literature. If you're doing a systematic review of studies that have been, it's critically important. But we weren't typically doing it. I think we weren't publishing all of our negative studies, not because we wanted to hide anything, but because, you do a study, it doesn't work, you kill the drug program, the drug doesn't go anywhere. Who needs to know that you had a negative study with that drug? You own the patent for that drug. No one's ever going to do a study with that drug again. So does it matter? Yeah, it does. It does matter, because as soon as you don't publish these things, people ask the question, why not? And what Ben did was persuade the industry that you had to publish absolutely everything. The only way for the public to trust us was to publish absolutely everything. And today, the pharmaceutical industry is pretty much perfect. We pretty much publish everything.
That's very reassuring.
Which is amazing. Yeah, I think it's brilliant. And the same is not true for academia. If you look at university or healthcare funded research, the publication rates for negative studies are near industry, and in some countries terrible. I mean, really, really poor. So I think that is the long answer to your question. What matters in terms of building trust? I think transparency. I think openness. You're looking at the Epstein files just now. Why is there so much fuss? There's so much fuss because they're not releasing the files. And by not releasing the files, people fill in, there must be something in them that's damaging to someone. As soon as you start keeping secrets from your wife, if she finds out that you've kept a secret,
you're in big trouble.
You're in big trouble. And you're in big trouble not just on that point, but you're in big trouble on everything.
I found that people appreciate full truth and understand them way better than half truth.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
How do you feel about press releases of new drugs? Have you ever come across...
They're very difficult to review from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, I've come across revolutionary breakthrough and stuff, game-changing kind of thing. Is this compliant or a bit naughty?
So I'm not going to be drawn on that.
Okay, all right. That's cool.
But press releases are governed by the same rules that govern all pharmaceutical industry communications. So they should not be promotional in tone. So a press release should not be promotional in tone. That shouldn't. Now, clearly you have to communicate science positively, a positive study which changes the game in a therapy area, a cure for cancer, whatever. And that's a groundbreaking moment. If your data really are really practice changing. Where you really struggle with press releases is the quote that you get from a clinician. So quite often the press will want to have a couple of clinical experts, people who've used the medicine in the healthcare system, and they may want a quote from them. And
this is allowed?
Yeah, it's allowed. It's encouraged for transparency and openness. It's better to have someone independent. But the challenge is they've often spent their whole life trying to develop new medicines in that therapeutic area, and they've finally succeeded in doing something groundbreaking, and they get very excited. And those are the quotes from the clinicians are often the challenging thing to approve. You very often have to say, look, we're governed by rules, and that's just a little bit too enthusiastic in terms of its language.
Overselling.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, so you've got to be careful.
David, you talk about translating innovation into impact, and this is a quote I pinched from you. This phrase suggests that there is a gap between a good idea and helping people. Where do you think brilliant ideas fall off the wagon?
At all sorts of stages along the way, I would say. And I see this. So the new company we set up, PM Life Sciences, one of our sort of missions is to help startups bring innovation to market. And the nature of healthcare, I was having a conversation with an angel investor recently, and he said, the challenge with healthcare innovation, with angel investing in the healthcare space, is that the path is often quite long, requires quite a big evidence base. There are regulatory hurdles. There are compliance challenges. It's difficult to innovate quickly and fail fast. You do need, I think, to innovate in the healthcare space, you need to have a degree of patience to navigate the process, and expertise and money. We have a real challenge in the UK of scaling up. So there was an excellent House of Lords report from Science and Technology Committee published last week, which started with the very provocative phrase, the British economy is bleeding out. And their thesis was that while we have a wonderful environment for life sciences, a great environment for startups, brilliant academic research, actually scaling those startups into large companies is a challenge. Adoption of innovation, gaining finance is often easier in other places. I think, is the hypothesis. The UK remains one of the great places to innovate and to do life sciences research and life sciences activity. But the US and China also have quite a lot of money and are competitive and sometimes get some of these things right. So I would say at all stages along the way. But it's hard. It's one of the reasons we set ourselves up, because I think we work with founders who've never done it before, and it can be discouraging. I think when it takes a long time, you've got to have that patience.
Yeah, it's shocking how brilliant science dies in the gap between research and delivery. Yeah, again, science is really the problem. It's the process that it has to go through.
Some of the death of science between research and delivery is about translating the science into a commercial impact, a commercial offering. So that translational element, it was something we thought about a lot at Prostate Cancer UK, because we funded a lot of basic science. And the question for me is, always has to be, so what? If you've got a scientific question, by all means ask science for science's sake. But the question is, at the end of the process, when we've discovered what we've discovered, what are you going to do with it?
Yes.
I'm advising a Parkinson's disease clinical trial accelerator, ACT PD, just now. And they've got a really clever idea. They're going to build a platform, clinical trial platform. They've built it, they've opened it, it's opened in a number of centres. They're looking at repurposing medicines to investigate whether these medicines are going to be effective in Parkinson's disease. And the conversation we're having just now, I think it's absolutely the right time to have it, is not how do we get a positive study, but what happens after that positive study. I mean, even in pharmaceutical industry, sometimes, because pricing in the US has always been so consistent and so once you've got a marketing authorization from the FDA, the American regulator, you can sell your product and
immediately.
You've got to negotiate with the payers, but there was, I think, much less scrutiny over pricing in the US than there is in the UK, for example.
Maybe that's not a good thing.
Well, you can argue it absolutely either way, and there are definitely challenges in both models. But what it did was it meant people didn't have to think during the development program about cost effectiveness analysis or how they want to bring it to the UK market. So you very often found yourself with challenges in getting reimbursement in the UK, having to collect additional data. I've always said, set out with a scientific idea, but have a clear plan of how you're going to get it to a patient. What is this going to do that improves patient care? And how do we need to build that evidence base?
I'm now curious about those drugs that do not make it to the NHS. They are there. They have been made already. Would they be available in the market for the private sector?
Sometimes.
Doesn't that mean that people with limited means might lose out on buying, because they usually go to the NHS. They don't go private. Those who go private are those who have lots of money. So yeah, an economic issue again. We
have less of a problem with that in the UK than we do in the US, for example. So, okay. But yeah, it is one of the great challenges. We see it in lots of other areas, though. Okay. I would challenge you to go and find yourself an NHS dentist.
Oh yeah, I do have one.
Well, I do have one. Incredibly envious.
But just because I used to teach the dentist, used to teach his children Arabic.
Okay, wow.
Okay, that's the only reason. He said to me, "Oh, we will open another clinic in Sevenoaks. That's why my dentist is in Sevenoaks." So I said, "Oh, okay, let's join," and I don't have to pay for it like I'm an NHS, so which is super rare in Kent.
It's rare. It's a real challenge now, and I think it's one of the real challenges that we have in this country. I think it's a sort of existential political discussion. What are we? Private education continually raises its head in the political discussion. Private dentistry, private healthcare.
I wouldn't be able to afford.
Sometimes you will find medicines available in private setting that aren't available to the healthcare system.
Going back to the start of your medical journey, you started as a surgeon. Mm-hmm. How does that real life hospital experience shape the decisions, the difficult decisions that you make today in pharma, in policy? I'm asking because I think, and I'm, I don't know what I'm talking about most of the time, but I think there might be an inherent flaw because those who make medical policy, they have never held a patient's hand before. So they probably don't know what people are going through, but they are at the top making medical decisions. But you straddle so many sectors.
Yeah, I mean, so okay, that's an interesting way of phrasing it. I think those experiences were very formative in everything I do, and in everything I think. I think there are some things that you get to do in life. It's really interesting. Most people's experience of the world is really narrow. That's the reality. If you work for if you're an accountant in a business and whatever, your friendship group will typically be quite homogenous. Your work colleagues will typically be fairly homogenous. The reality is my professional experience is homogenous, right? I mean, that's my professional experience. The very interesting thing about interacting with the public in any shape, whether you're an ambulance driver or a policeman or a nurse or a doctor, dare I say it, even a politician, actually, because a lot of what politicians do is social work. Really, if you think about the casework they do in their communities,
I can imagine that.
They do a huge amount of interacting with all sorts of people, many of whom are in deep crisis. To go to your MP for help requires you to be in a difficult place quite often. So I think our politicians do get this, actually, interestingly. I mean, they live in a bit of a Westminster bubble, but I think they do also live in constituencies with diverse populations of people, and they interact with them in a professional capacity. You get to see people when you're a doctor. You get to see people from every walk of life, often at the most vulnerable point in their life. And for me, it'd be interesting. I left clinical medicine on just after my 30th birthday. So I've never been a doctor in my 30s.
No.
I've been a doctor in my 20s, my teen medical student, and a doctor in my teens and 20s. I often look back and think about the things I did and saw and had to deal with psychologically as a child. I mean, I think I'm probably not a child now. I'm nearly 50. I'm 48 years old. I'm probably now don't feel like a child. But I look back to David in his 20s, handling life, and I was a surgeon, right? Handling life and death, handling complex diagnoses, breaking bad news, challenging situations. And I think it does shape all of your worldview subsequently. I think experiencing human suffering in that way and human challenges in that way and at such a formative part of your life, you can't help but have a different outlook.
Yeah, and I can imagine that emotional or emotion-driven decisions can be financially unsafe in a population level system like the NHS. So maybe, just maybe, those who make decisions about new drugs, for example, as we've been discussing, should take a bit of an unemotional stance so they can make the right decisions. That's sometimes how I view it. And I think this mirrors a number of institutions in this country and other countries. Like, for example, I've been pondering about this in my child's school, and I think this applies to a number of schools I've been in touch with as well. All the teachers are brilliant, are kind, are sensitive, are emotional, are like brilliant. The head teacher? And I mean, when you think of it, how would she or he run a school efficiently, properly, with rules and regulation if she's touchy-feely, lovey-dovey? Even if she were before, she had to take a different character to be able to run a school. It comes with the system kind of thing. Yeah, this is off point a little bit, but
I think your approach to leadership is shaped by... Leadership's a really interesting question. Your response to your approach to leadership is shaped by your formative experiences as well.
I was raised in a non-school.
You were raised
in a nun school.
Okay.
That's why. If we dig deep into
this again, we're stringing to Alain Breton's podcast again. It's becoming philosophy rather than science. I concede that, but I think you've got to decide what kind of leader you are. And I watched lots of different, and I don't think I knew I was doing it, but I watched lots of different leadership styles when I was going through my formative years, my training years. I worked for a couple of surgeons, both of whom though were amazing in their way. One was a flamboyant operator, wonderfully good at what he did, quick but really safe, just brilliant. The other, much more meticulous, much slower, much more thoughtful, very similar outcomes. I mean, if anything, the more sort of flamboyant, older surgeon was probably the better surgeon, actually, if I had to choose. And they had a completely different leadership style as well. And I think it was based on the same issue. So the more flamboyant surgeon was much more relaxed, much more easygoing. He demanded high standards, but he did it in a really kind, supportive, considerate way. The much more meticulous surgeon was much harder on people, gave some people a really hard time at times. And I reflect on that. Leadership it's a function of who you are, how comfortable you feel. How do you relax into leading people? You relax into leading people when you feel secure. And I think if you don't feel secure, there's a risk you cannot relax into leadership. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. How did being a surgeon in my 20s shape me? I think it's created a sort of humility. I hope.
I could see that clearly.
Oh, can you? Good. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
And the priority in all the discussions now for you is always patients and patients' care and how they could benefit from whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I think that has been a real big... In society, I really care about... People will argue with me about this, but I really care about our country. I actually do genuinely care about Britain. It's funny, we talk about identity. I mean, my wife's a Polish Australian. I'm an Irish migrant to the west of Scotland, and we now live in England. My kids don't know what on earth they are in that context.
Doesn't matter, really. Does it matter? Do we have to pinpoint a certain identity? People often ask me, especially the new people that I meet, how do I define myself, where I am most comfortable? But I really, maybe I can't define it. I'm most comfortable, I'm happiest, I'm most supported in England, in the UK. I'm most respected. I feel safe and happy here. So this is home. This is where I belong. Those are the people who support me. I support back. Not back in Egypt.
I think that's lovely to hear, and I think that's right. I think your identity is a little bit about where you feel safe and comfortable. And I've been lucky. The UK has been great. I mean, I'm Scottish. I was born here, but we've been very lucky to raise our children in a great country. And I think so. I do. It's not always been driven by patients individually. I mean, I've stood for Parliament and I do a bit of mentoring for the Social Mobility Foundation. There's lots of things that I do, and it's not always about patients, but it is always about people. It is always about trying to make things a bit better for the people you interact with. They don't remember what you did. They remember how you made them feel, right? That's the old slightly trite adage, but that's kind of always driven me. And I was very acutely aware in every interaction I had in medicine that it didn't matter to me. It was another interaction. I'd probably see 50 patients that day, whatever I was doing, and none of them would some of them do stick out, interestingly, but most of them would not stick out. So how many? I was a surgeon for 8 years. I was sort of seeing 40 or 50 patients on average every day. I mean, you can do the numbers, right?
Wow.
I can probably remember the names of 6 or 7 people that I and maybe another 10 or 12 people whose names I don't remember, but I do remember the interaction out of thousands of interactions. My suspicion is almost every single one of those people who had a significant interaction will remember me or remember it because it was so substantial to what happened to them. That's the thing you've got to kind of remember when you're in these situations is the power dynamic's really interesting. It's very different. It's very routine being in a hospital when you're a doctor. It's not very routine being in a hospital as a patient.
PM Life Sciences. You co-founded PM Life Sciences with Dr. Please correct my pronunciation, Sheuli Porkess.
Beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, what is the problem that you guys are trying to solve?
I think we've talked a little bit about it. I think what we would like PM Life Sciences to be is a vehicle for helping to get innovation. I mean, we're 5 or 6 weeks old, and I think we are still trying to work out where the impact is. But we're working with a number of startups just now to help those startups take their product through the complexity of the development program. We would love to build an offering for the biotech sector. I think one of our challenges, one of the things, having sat on the Cancer Drugs Fund, having sat on the Scottish Medicines Consortium, having done lots of launches, I've often said I wish I'd been involved earlier on in these development programs. I would have shaped differently the way we collected evidence and data and brought those medicines to market. I think we could have done it quicker. So I'd love to build a bit of an offering for the biotech sector. We're working with a little company called Health Exbridge that a colleague friend now set up recently. So we're still trying to formalize what that relationship looks like. But that's a really interesting change management business. So the founders are very senior NHS executive and a very experienced organizational change management, leadership training professional. And they're building an organization who's really going to help industry and the healthcare system work to streamline how they do things and how they introduce innovation. Yeah. So there's some really interesting avenues that we could take PM Life Sciences. And I think, as I say, we're trying to nail exactly what it is we do. But ultimately, it will be helping people with clever ideas get them to patients.
Yeah, amazing. We're not a business podcast, but if it's medicine related, we're in. When you meet a brilliant team with a very clever idea, what tells you that this idea can scale responsibly versus clever idea, bad strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you can sometimes fix a strategy. That's not a major challenge. I did a little bit of angel investing before, while I was still working in the pharmaceutical industry, employed by companies. I am still in the pharmaceutical industry, but still employed by companies. One of the really important things is the founder and the team. For me, if I'm going to support something, the founder really matters. The quality of the people around them, the credibility, how well they understand what's going on, what their perseverance and determination looks like. I think that's really, really important. The idea, there's got to be a clear problem, a clear solution, protectable IP. So you do see people coming with stuff that you just think, well, particularly in the AI era, if you can't patent something in a way that doesn't allow someone else to bring in something very similar, the reality is you're just going to have a crowded marketplace. Lots of people come to me with apps.
Yes, it's the next best thing.
I don't get very excited by many of it. Every now and then someone comes with something really clever, but not often.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's a brilliant founder team, an addressable problem, some clear IP, some protectable IP, and you can fix most plans. Those are the basic sort of building blocks, I think, of a potentially winning strategy.
You say in your biography that you love politics. Okay. On one condition. What is that condition?
what did I say in my button? This is on my LinkedIn profile. I love politics, but only where it works constructively for a solution or
I think you said when it brings people together.
when it brings people together. Yeah.
That's a bit rare in today's
I love
polarized.
politics. I love the cut and thrust of politics. I mean, you've seen that come through, and I love thinking about our policy environment. I love thinking about how we make things better. My challenge with politics, I ran for Parliament in 2015, and I found it a deeply lonely experience. I found it such a lonely experience that even though I stayed involved in politics, I've never run again. I made a somewhat half-hearted attempt in 2019. Didn't get selected for a seat, but we've now had 3 general elections since I stood, and there's a bit of me still has this sort of itch in the background for politics. There's still something there, I think, that I struggle a little bit with, that I haven't done it.
Maybe you're not pragmatic enough.
Maybe I wasn't enough in the party. Maybe I'm too pragmatic, perhaps, and not partisan enough. But yeah, I hated the experience in 2015, and I got asked to stand in 2016 for Holyrood, and couldn't say no quickly enough. So it's interesting. I worry sometimes that our political system, I don't see consistently groups of people working together for the common good. You know, I think our party politics has become so unstable and so fragmented. And these are people's careers. I get that. You know, if you lose the next election, there's a real problem, because you can only achieve things if you're in power. You can only make things happen if you're in power, really. And so I understand why it's really important to people, but I get the sense that short electoral cycles, very turbulent political situation. You know, we had an election in 2015, 2017, 2019. We had COVID. We had the 2024 general election. It's been a period of profound turbulence and instability. If Keir Starmer gets overthrown by someone in the next 6 months, which is entirely possible, we're starting to see lots of rumours, he will be the 5th Prime Minister. Whoever replaces him will be the 5th Prime Minister in 4 years, 3 years, from across 2 political parties. Yeah. That's crazy.
A very quick turnover.
And I do worry sometimes about politics that creates a sort of churn, immediacy. So yeah, I think, but you do see amazing people sometimes getting to terms with difficult, complicated issues, and over a long period of time persevering to try and make things better. I'm deeply divided over the idea of politicians. I think sometimes it can be challenging, but I think we're hard on our politicians. We give them a very difficult job, and I've been lucky enough to meet lots of politicians in my time. I've been lucky enough to meet lots of politicians in my time that I've been really impressed by and have a huge amount of respect for what they're trying to achieve. Yeah. But yeah, I think for me, I've always felt I need to try and do something better to make things better. Yeah. I think that's probably why I've changed careers and changed industries a few times, because I think I always want to make myself better. I want to learn, I want to understand, I want to listen, I want to find out, I want to challenge myself and challenge others. Britain's a great country, but it is. But it has got no God-given right to exist. Yeah. It needs to fight to be Britain every single day, and I worry at the moment our language is quite divisive. Our society is I've got some choices to make, and I do get concerned about that. Politics that brings people together, for me, works better than that which divides.
Absolutely. And talking about politics and policy making and these things, the essence of scientific innovation is creativity. Mm-hmm. Right? To me, science is like art. It's just the other side of the coin. How can we keep curiosity and imagination alive in a sector that's so highly regulated and structured with all the rules going around. How does it happen? How can we shield our scientists and our physicians so they are focused on the mission ahead?
I've always looked to the problem first. What is it I'm trying to solve? What is it I'm trying to achieve? What is it I'm trying to make better? And worry about the regulation to some extent subsequently. I think there have been times in my career where that hasn't been true.
Did that distract you from the mission?
Yeah, it does. And actually probably means I have at times contributed negatively to the mission, got in the way of the mission. So I think a separation is helpful. So it's probably what I loved about Pfizer. Pfizer was really interesting to work at. I was a medical director of oncology, but I wasn't responsible for compliance fundamentally. Of course, I was responsible for compliance. We're all responsible for compliance. But I had compliance teams which worked brilliantly. We had committees and groups. We had signatories. We had lots and lots of layers and processes, and I wasn't ultimately accountable for compliance. We had a UK general manager who was ultimately accountable for compliance, and that meant I didn't have to worry about it. I had to be aware of it. I had to make sure that whatever I decided I was going to do was compliant. I had to follow systems and processes, but I could have fun and be creative. When you're actually responsible for compliance, when it's you, the buck stops with you, particularly in smaller companies where you don't have much of a team, I think it can stifle your creativity, because what you're trying to do is, will I get thrown out of this company for not being super creative and doing lots of really interesting stuff? No. Will I get thrown out of this company if we have a compliance disaster? Yeah, we will. So the incentives that we give to people change depending on what they're accountable and responsible for. And I think wherever you can, if we can separate, that's one of the things about PM Life Sciences. Hopefully, the companies we pick up, the founders can continue to innovate and play and think, and we'll worry about the compliance for them. We'll worry about the process for them. Maybe that's not the ideal company for me to have set up. No, but that does allow us to give them that freedom. I think that's probably the really important thing.
David, we conclude our episodes with visionary, moral, and ethical questions.
Okay.
Not to imply that all the previous wasn't moral and ethical. I think this structure is a little bit off with these episodes. Now, when you think of where life sciences could be in 10 years, what's your vision? Not the policymaker's vision, not the industry's vision, your vision. Where do you see life sciences going?
In the UK or generally?
In the UK.
I'd love us to be a more integrated ecosystem.
Give me examples, please, in practice.
I'd love to see the pharmaceutical industry, government, the regulators, and the NHS working even more closely together to take advantage of the huge opportunity that we have afforded by, I think we're on the cusp of one of the great technical revolutions.
Are you referring to AI?
No, I'm referring to, AI is part of it, but I'm referring to genomics, genetic medicine, gene editing technology, longevity medicine, quantum computing.
Very exciting stuff.
All sorts of stuff. I've got a really great colleague called Imran Koza who runs a business consulting on the future of healthcare, and it's incredible what could happen. And I think what I'd love is for the UK to be harnessing its unique power. We've got things like John Bell's My Future Health project. We've got Genomics England. We've got the Genomic Reference Labs. We've got a very, very forward-thinking regulator. We've got a great ecosystem, lots of startups, amazing academia in our universities. We've got a healthcare system, which is, whatever we said earlier about it being lots and lots of individual entities, nonetheless an integrated service. population-wide, we've got huge advantages. We've been talking about those huge advantages for 7 or 8 years, and I'm not sure that we've capitalised on them to nearly the extent that we should have done over that time. And I think what I would love to see 10 years from now is that we are seen as one of the pioneering places in the world, to take advantage of some of these new technologies, new approaches and new techniques. I think people are getting very excited about China just now. Really excited about China, and there's some amazing stuff happening there. I'd love people to be that excited about Britain. I'd love there to be the liquidity in the system, the money in the system, because people they want to build and scale businesses here. Because we've got the ecosystem to do it, the support to do it, and we've got the patients who want to access these medicines, the healthcare system willing to pay for them. I think that would be amazing.
Yeah. We also talk endlessly about transparency. What does true openness mean in healthcare?
Depends who you ask, depends when you ask it. If you'd asked me this as a doctor, I would have said willingness to admit mistakes, willingness to apologise when things go wrong, willingness to learn from those mistakes and ensure they don't happen again in the future. I would have said that's really a fundamental key tenet of clinical openness and transparency.
But someone could lose their job because of this.
Yeah, they could. I know what you mean by that. I don't think people lose their jobs because they make an honest mistake and they report it and they try and learn from it. I think people lose their jobs. I think the world is incredibly tolerant of honest, well-intentioned people making mistakes. I think what people are intolerant of is being lied to or covered up.
When they make mistakes and hide the mistakes and making excuses for the mistakes. I get that.
I'm a responsible officer for revalidation at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, among the many other things I do. And what that means is that I make the decision, ultimately 720 doctors who revalidate, so they maintain their license to practice with the GMC through me. And I make a recommendation every 5 years to the GMC whether this person has demonstrated that they remain fit to practice. And if someone comes to me, or the appraisal process, and I get a summary, if someone has made a mistake, put it into their portfolio, reflected on what's happened, what they would do differently, changed it, I look on that as an incredibly positive thing. If I subsequently discover something absolutely appalling's happened and they've not admitted it and then it's happened again, I'm much, much more worried about that. Yeah. So that's I think the openness. And we've talked a little bit about what openness means in the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's just being honest with the public. It's being honest with people.
Yeah. The pharmaceutical industry, they do get a lot of criticism. Where do you think legitimate criticism holds up?
I think a lot of the criticism of the pharmaceutical industry is ill-founded. But I think we have difficulty or reluctance, I think, to stick our head above the parapet and speak in public about the challenges of, this is a commercial sector, it's a commercial entity trying to innovate in a highly regulated and very difficult environment. And I think for the most part, pharma companies, I've never felt uncomfortable as a doctor practicing in any of the companies. I've never felt like we were doing things that I wasn't proud of at any stage. You don't get everything right all the time, but I've never been concerned by that. And so if we have an internal criticism of ourselves that I think is absolutely right, is that I don't think we stand up and scream and shout enough, confidently enough. I don't think we do enough to combat disinformation. I think we're a little, in the UK certainly, we're a little timid about our communication with the public. I think we could be braver.
Is that because of the rules and regulations?
Yeah, I think we're worried about when it becomes promoting to the public or getting involved in a discussion externally. I mean, one of the worst things you can do when someone sends you a bad comment on social media is respond.
Oh yeah, that would be a fight.
Yeah, you just ignore it, right? And I think But the trouble with just ignoring stuff is that we don't always. I don't think we've consistently and effectively enough told the story of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why. I think the industry has contributed hugely to human health. Right? I mean, companies have discovered medicines and done amazing things, and I think we should be more proud of that.
Yeah, and you just told me off air that you wouldn't have possibly done this, we'll call it interview, but it's just a conversation, if you were still working in a pharma company.
Yeah, I think we would have been nervous about where it would go to. I think that's
Yes.
and I mean we've spoken for a long time today. We've been quite open, and I hope people will look at it and be proud of what we've done. But yeah, I think it's difficult for companies to do this.
Yeah. In the last 10, 20 years, how did your beliefs about healthcare changed? You can include regrets if you want.
I don't think my view on healthcare has changed much. I think my perspective has changed. I think there are other things that have changed much, much more. I'd say I've learned much more about myself, particularly through COVID, but I've learned much more about myself than I have. I think I still think about medicine and life sciences and healthcare similarly to the way I always have. I think I see myself very differently. It's very interesting. I feel a little sorry for David in his 20s. I look back and people say, what would you say if you could meet your 18-year-old self? I'd give him a hug. Poor boy.
Poor surgeon.
He doesn't know what's about to hit him. I've become more tolerant of the challenges. Maybe I was more frustrated by the problems I saw. 48-year-old David may have been more patient and not left the healthcare system when I did at 30. I may have been less easily frustrated. I think I probably did get a bit frustrated and probably was a bit impatient, particularly working in the healthcare system. I mean, when you work in the healthcare system, you meet people who are amazing all the time, but you occasionally meet people who are absolutely not. And I tended to take that quite personally, found it quite difficult. But everyone's battling their own demons and challenges.
Yes. Now, if you had to place a bet on an emerging technology that's going to change medicine forever, what would it be?
There are so many things that I think could really change medicine forever. I think gene editing techniques could be astonishing. I think there are all sorts of things which are going to make the process of discovery much, much easier. Our ability to process the large data sets that we will require to process in order to find information, spot innovation, effect change, develop therapies. If we're doing population-wide genetic analysis to look for things, we could never have managed the computational power to do that 10 years ago. I think with AI and with other advances in technology, we will be better able to do those kind of genomic analyses, genomic assessments. I think we'll probably still need medicines. And I think our ability to screen drug candidates in silico, in computer modeling, using quantum analysis, quantum computing, could revolutionize the speed and efficiency of drug development, drug design, drug discovery, which would be game changing in terms of cost. So if you could really reduce the waste and the wasted effort and the duplication of effort and the time taken, why do we have to charge the money we charge? It's because of the time and the costs of development. It's expensive and it's difficult and it's fraught with risk. A lot of these techniques are going to make it shorter and less difficult and less fraught with risk. And I can envisage a world where healthcare becomes cheaper and easier to deliver. I think we will take for granted many of the innovations that we today feel out of grasp, as we have done throughout human history, right? If you look back 50 years ago, we're in a completely different world today than we were in when I was born, and in so many ways. So yeah, so many things will change.
David, please finish this sentence for me. Healthcare is most beautiful when...
It's available to all.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Simple and to the point. David, I've been writing some notes here about how I summarize the past 6 hours. Your ability to bridge medicine, policy, and ethics with getting the right treatments to patients is absolutely remarkable. You've reminded us today that healthcare transformation isn't just technical, it's also moral. And that progress happens when integrity meets action. What stands out in your commitment is that you don't aim to change from the outside as a critic, but from the inside as a builder. And this is a way to change things. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.